The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 1. Audiobook Listening Script. The Engineered Ecstasy, Reconstructing Ancient Ritual Technologies of Consciousness by Fletcher. Part 1 of 2, Framework and 4 Historical Case Studies. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 2. Series Introduction. Welcome to the Historical Documents Access Project, an ongoing series created to make important historical documents and historical research more accessible to English-speaking listeners. This is part 1 of a 2-part audiobook presentation of The Engineered Ecstasy, Reconstructing Ancient Ritual Technologies of Consciousness by Fletcher. In this installment, the author introduces ritual as a form of cognitive technology and examines 4 historical case studies: Chavín de Huántar, the Eleusinian Mysteries, the Vedic Soma sacrifice, and the Mazatec Velada. This recording is presented for education, preservation, and historical study. The views and claims in the text belong to the author. This presentation is not medical advice and should not be understood as encouragement to use controlled substances. You are listening to Part 1 of the series. Part I, Ritual as Cognitive Technology, 1.1. The Fallacy That Made Us Forget. There is a mistake at the center of how the modern West has thought about drugs, and it took most of the 20th century to make, and we are only now beginning to notice we have made it. The mistake is the belief that when a person takes a psychoactive substance, whatever happens in the following hours is caused by the molecule, and whatever surrounds the taking is decoration. Almost every part of that belief is wrong. The molecule is doing something, yes, but the singing and the darkness and the fasting that preceded the taking, and the presence of trusted others, and the story the participant was told about what was going to happen, and the temperature of the room, and the color of the walls, and the memory of the last time someone from this community made this same journey, all of that is doing something too. In many cases, it is doing more than the molecule. And the specific and beautiful thing that ancient religious cultures figured out, thousands of years before anyone thought to test them in a laboratory, is that if you engineer the surroundings correctly, the molecule and the ritual do not add, they multiply. This book is about that multiplication. It is about the small number of ancient traditions that appear to have mastered it deliberately, and about what modern neuroscience can now tell us about why what they were doing worked. It is also, unavoidably, a book about how much we forgot when we decided that the only real thing was the pill. The archaeological record of Chavín de Huántar has been sitting in the Peruvian Andes for 3,000 years. The Rigveda has been sitting in libraries for at least that long. The Florentine Codex was compiled in the middle of the 16th century and has been available in scholarly translation since the 20th. Everything I am going to describe in this book, The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 3, was already there. What was missing was the framework to see it. The recognition that these were not primitive religious ceremonies decorated with intoxicating plants, but sophisticated cognitive interventions in which the plant was one instrument in a much larger orchestra. I want to make a claim at the outset and defend it through the rest of the book. The claim is this: the ancient traditions we are about to examine were doing applied cognitive science. Not applied cognitive science with modern vocabulary. Not applied cognitive science with fMRI verification. But applied cognitive science in the sense that they were reliably producing a specific alteration of consciousness in a specific population of participants, using a specific integrated intervention. And they had figured out the design through millennia of iteration. They knew what worked. They encoded what worked in stone and in ritual sequence and in initiation. They lost some of it to conquest and to the deliberate suppression of the traditions by later religious authorities. And they retained more of it than we tend to give them credit for. And in the last 50 years, working in laboratories and clinics that would have been unimaginable to the Chavín priesthood or the Vedic Hotra, we have been slowly and independently confirming the design principles they were operating on. One variable at a time, one paper at a time, one new imaging modality at a time. Rediscovery, not discovery. You do not have to take my word for any of this. The evidence is on the table now, in a way it was not 30 years ago. But I should be clear that I write as someone who takes the traditions seriously on their own terms. I do not think the priests at Chavín were fooling themselves about what they were doing. I do not think María Sabina was performing folk theater. I do not think the Hotra chanting the 9th mandala of the Rigveda into a fire was engaged in empty ceremony. I think they were doing something that worked, and that they knew was working, and that had specific, reliable effects on the participants who came to them. Where the ancient claims are extraordinary, that the practitioners could see things ordinary vision does not reach, that they could speak with entities the uninitiated could not perceive, that they could induce in the participant a felt experience of immortality, I do not automatically translate those claims into psychological or symbolic language. I let them stand. Then I ask what modern neuroscience and archaeology have to say about them, and I try to hold both together, honestly. That is the posture of this book. Take the ancient claims at face value. Take the modern research at face value. Where they converge, name the convergence. Where they diverge, name the divergence. Where the ancient claim outruns what we can currently test, mark it as awaiting further work, rather than dismissing it as superstition or accepting it as literal fact. What emerges from that discipline over the course of the 6 historical case studies and the modern practitioner case that make up part 2 of this book is a picture of ritual technology that is both stranger and more coherent than anything I found in either the pop psychedelic literature or the standard academic treatments. Stranger because the traditions were, in fact, doing exactly what they said they were doing. More coherent because when you decompose what they were doing into its component parts, every part turns out to have a modern research literature behind it, and the parts fit together. Let us begin with the most important modern academic contribution to this whole picture, because it is the framework the rest of the book will build on. 1.2. What set and setting really means. The phrase set and setting entered the psychedelic vocabulary in the early 1960s when Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner used it to name the extra pharmacological factors that shape the experience produced by drugs like LSD and psilocybin. Set meant the mindset the participant brings, personality, preparation, intention, expectation. Setting meant the environment in which the experience takes place, physical, social, cultural. The phrase caught on because it named something that early psychedelic researchers had already noticed but did not have a word for, that the same dose of the same drug given to the same person in different contexts could produce radically different experiences. The dose was not the whole story. The context was doing real causal work. For most of the intervening 60 years, set and setting has been used loosely in the psychedelic community as a piece of practical wisdom. Do it with people you trust, do it in a place you feel safe, have a plan for how you want to spend the time. This is not wrong, but it substantially undersells what the concept actually contains. The most rigorous contemporary academic treatment of set and setting theory comes from Ido Hartogsohn, a researcher at Bar-Ilan University whose 2020 book, American Trip, published by MIT Press, is the definitive scholarly history of how set and setting shaped the American psychedelic experience through the 20th century. Hartogsohn's contribution has been to take the concept back to its full theoretical seriousness and to extend it in a direction that has not received enough attention. The recognition that individual set and setting is itself shaped by what he calls the collective set and setting. The broader historical, social, and cultural forces that determine at a population level what kinds of individual experience are possible in a given place and time. The reason this extension matters is that it dissolves a common confusion. If you notice that the LSD experience in America in 1965 looked systematically different from the LSD experience in Czechoslovakia in 1965, and that both look systematically different from the ayahuasca experience in a Santo Daime church in Brazil in 2005, the naive conclusion is that the drug was behaving differently in different bodies. It was not. The molecule does the same thing in every mammalian brain. What was different was the meaning structure into which the molecule was being received. America 1965 was expecting revolution. Czechoslovakia 1965 was expecting espionage. And a Santo Daime Tribalo in 2005 is expecting communion with entities named in a specific hymnal. The molecule enters that meaning structure and gets shaped by it. What the participant experiences is not the pharmacology alone. It is the pharmacology inflected through everything the culture and the tradition and the immediate ritual container have told the participant to expect. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 5. This is not a small effect. This is the effect. In his 2021 paper in Frontiers in Pharmacology, Hartigzone works through the Santo Daime tradition in exactly the way this book will work through Chavín and Eleusis and the Mazatec Velada, systematically identifying the ordering principles, techniques, and symbology the tradition uses to shape and direct the ayahuasca experience. The paper is important for what follows because it demonstrates that the analytical work is doable, that one can take a specific ritual tradition, decompose it into its component set and setting mechanisms, and track how each mechanism shapes the drug response. What Hartigzone does for the Santo Daime, this book does for the 6 historical traditions of Part 2. The methodology is the same. The stakes are, if anything, higher, because the historical traditions had thousands of years to iterate on the design. There is a second reason to take Hartigzone's framework seriously, and it comes from an unexpected direction. In 2016, he published a paper in the Journal of Psychopharmacology arguing that set and setting theory and placebo theory are addressing the same underlying phenomenon, the shaping of pharmacological outcome by non-pharmacological factors, through different disciplinary vocabularies. Set and setting research studies active substances whose effects vary with context. Placebo research studies inert substances that produce clinical effects. Both are studying the same thing: the human capacity to have the meaning of a treatment produce the physiological effects of the treatment, in whole or in part. Once you notice this, everything changes, because the placebo literature, which has been developed under much more rigorous experimental conditions than the psychedelic literature, turns out to have quantified the meaning-response effect very precisely, and the numbers are not small. In some clinical domains, the meaning response is doing more of the causal work than the drug itself. Which brings us to Ted Kapkuk. 1.3. The meaning response and what it means for ritual. Ted Kapkuk directs the program in placebo studies at Harvard Medical School, and over the last 2 decades, his group has done a series of clinical trials that, taken together, dismantle almost everything most people believe about placebos. The most important of these, for the purposes of this book, is a 2008 randomized controlled trial published in the British Medical Journal that examined the treatment of irritable bowel syndrome. The trial had 3 arms. The first arm received no treatment at all beyond the standard clinical assessment. The second arm received placebo acupuncture, needles applied in a way that produced sensation but no active treatment, with a limited, business-like patient-practitioner interaction. The third arm received the same placebo acupuncture but with an augmented patient-practitioner relationship characterized by warmth, attention, and confidence. The 3 arms were designed to decompose the placebo effect into 3 separable components: assessment and observation, the therapeutic ritual, and the supportive relationship. The question was whether each component contributed independently to the outcome. Each did. The augmented relationship arm produced significantly more improvement than the limited interaction arm, which produced significantly more improvement than the no treatment arm. The effect was cumulative and additive, and the size of the total effect, produced entirely by inert needles and a warm clinical encounter, was comparable to the effect sizes produced by pharmaceutical treatments for the same condition. This finding is the reason the concept of ritual technology is worth taking seriously as a scientific matter. The Kapkuk decomposition tells us that the therapeutic effect of a clinical encounter can be broken into components, that each component contributes independently to the total response, and that the total response is large enough to matter clinically. That is exactly the analytical structure I want to apply to the ritual traditions we are about to examine. When we look at what the Chavín priests were doing to the pilgrim who walked into the underground galleries, we are not going to treat the ritual as an undifferentiated experience that either worked or did not work. We are going to decompose it. The pilgrimage from up to 500 kilometers away that constituted the pre-ritual expectancy period. The fasting that established the metabolic substrate. The pharmacological administration of the San Pedro brew, now chemically confirmed. The sensory environment of the underground labyrinth. The specific acoustic frequencies of the Strombus conch trumpets, whose brain hemisphere effects have been documented in modern psychoacoustic research. The spatial disorientation produced by the maze itself. The interpretive climax at the encounter with the Lanzon monolith. Each of these components is doing independent causal work. The total effect is what the ritual was engineered to produce. This is the same analytical method Kapchuk used on the clinical encounter, applied to a ritual event 3,000 years older and considerably more elaborate. Kapchuk's subsequent work has taken this line of inquiry in an even more remarkable direction. In 2010, his group published in PLOS ONE the first randomized controlled trial of open-label placebo. Placebo treatment administered without deception, with the patients explicitly told that the pills they were receiving contained no active medication and were, quote, made of an inert substance, like sugar pills. The patients improved anyway, significantly more than the no-treatment controls. A larger 2021 trial published in Pain found that open-label placebo produced improvement statistically indistinguishable from double-blind placebo in the same condition. Both were dramatically better than no treatment. Take a moment with what these findings mean. The standard explanation for the placebo response, the explanation that has been taught in medical schools for most of the last century, is that patients must believe they are receiving an active treatment for the response to occur. That explanation is now known to be false. The response occurs when the patients know the pills are inert. What the response requires is not deception. It is the ritual structure of medical care itself, the examination, the therapeutic act, the supportive relationship, the meaning frame within which, here is your treatment, gets received. The human body responds to the meaning of the encounter, not to the pharmacology of the substance, even when the meaning is explicitly labeled as containing no substance at all. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 7. The anthropologist Daniel Moriman, his 2002 monograph, Meaning, Medicine, and the Placebo Effect, is the definitive scholarly treatment of this reframing, has argued that we should retire the term placebo response altogether and replace it with meaning response. Placebos, he points out, are inert. They cannot cause anything. What causes the observed clinical effects is the response of the patient to the meaning of the treatment context. That response is not psychological in the dismissive sense. It is fully physiological. Placebo administration produces measurable dopamine release in Parkinson's patients. It produces measurable endogenous opioid release in pain patients. It produces measurable immune modulation. It is a real biological response produced by a real biological mechanism in response to a real cognitive input that has nothing to do with the pharmacology of any substance. If a warm clinical encounter and an admitted sugar pill can produce measurable neurochemical change in a 15-minute doctor's visit, imagine what a 3-day fast, followed by a pilgrimage through mountain passes, followed by an underground journey by torchlight through a labyrinth designed to disorient the senses, followed by the ingestion of a mescaline-containing cactus brew, followed by the sudden illumination of a fanged granite deity, while a hidden priest speaks from a chamber above. Imagine what all of that, stacked together, does to the biology of a participant who has been prepared for years to receive it. That is what Chavín was engineered to produce. That is what this book is trying to reconstruct. 4. The choir principle at ritual scale. In nutritional pharmacology, there is a well-documented phenomenon called polyvalent synergy. The classic example is the enhancement of curcumin bioavailability by co-consumption of piperine from black pepper. Curcumin on its own is poorly absorbed. the plasma concentration after a large oral dose is unimpressively low. Add a small amount of piperine, which inhibits the cytochrome enzymes that would otherwise clear the curcumin from circulation, and the plasma concentration rises by roughly 2,000%. The two compounds do not add, they multiply. Neither is doing anything particularly remarkable on its own. The combination is doing something completely different from what either compound does in isolation. This is not a rare phenomenon. It is documented across dozens of traditional food combinations. The sulforaphane in cruciferous vegetables is dramatically increased by the addition of exogenous myrosinase from mustard powder. The anthocyanins in dark berries are stabilized and better absorbed in the presence of vitamin C. Fat-soluble vitamins require fat to be absorbed at all. Iron absorption is enhanced by vitamin C and inhibited by tannins. Traditional cuisines the world over encode this synergy in their combinations, often in ways the cooks themselves cannot explain and yet reliably follow. In my own work on food and cognition, I have come to call this the choir principle. Individual bioactive compounds, like individual voices, produce a limited effect on their own, but the correct combination produces a qualitatively different result. No single voice is doing what the choir does. The choir is not a sum. It is an emergent phenomenon that depends on the specific stacking of the components. The argument of this book is that the ancient ritual technologies of consciousness operate on precisely this principle, one level of abstraction higher. Where the choir principle in nutrition describes the synergistic action of molecules operating on parallel biochemical pathways, the choir principle at ritual scale describes the synergistic action of interventions operating on parallel neural and cognitive pathways. The mescaline in a San Pedro brew is doing one specific thing. It is agonizing serotonin 5-HT2A receptors, with cascading effects on cortical processing and on the coherence of the brain's default mode network. It does that thing whether the participant is drinking the brew alone in a well-lit kitchen or is drinking it as the pharmacological component of the Chavín ritual sequence. What Chavín does is stack the mescaline with a series of other interventions, each of which recruits a different neural mechanism. The 110 Hz frequencies of the Pututu conch trumpets shift hemispheric activation, as documented in a 2008 study at the University of California, Los Angeles. The near-total darkness of the underground galleries alters default mode network coherence in ways that are only beginning to be mapped by modern research on sensory deprivation. The right-angle turns and shifting corridors of the labyrinth disrupt vestibular processing. The presence of other pilgrims moving in synchrony elevates endogenous oxytocin. The interpretive framework the participant carried into the ritual, formed by years of collective preparation, recruits the meaning response mechanisms Kapchak has documented. Each of these interventions has been studied in isolation in modern laboratories. Each has measurable effects. What the Chavín architects were doing was combining them into a single stacked event that engaged all of these mechanisms at once. The combined effect is what modern participants in reconstructed traditional ceremonies consistently describe as qualitatively different from and more transformative than the effect of the plant alone. This description is not merely subjective. It is what the choir principle predicts. If you stack 5 or 6 interventions that recruit independent neural pathways, the effect on consciousness is not the arithmetic sum of the individual effects. It is an emergent phenomenon that neither the pharmacology alone nor the ritual alone can produce. This is why a psilocybin session in a clinical trial and a psilocybin session in a Mazatec Velada, using ostensibly the same active molecule, produce experiences that participants describe in completely different registers. The pharmacology is the same. The choir is not. The methodological consequence for what follows is that this book will not treat any of the 6 historical traditions of Part 2 as isolated cultural curiosities. It will treat them as data points in a comparative analysis, asking for each one what specific interventions were being stacked, in what sequence, and to what mechanistic end. Where the traditions overlap in their stacking choices, that overlap is significant. It suggests convergent discovery of underlying principles that work regardless of which culture is doing the discovering. Where they diverge, the divergence is also significant because it points to genuinely different design solutions to the same underlying problem. The strongest single piece of evidence for the framework, however, is not any of the historical traditions on its own. It is the fact that a modern practitioner, working 3,000 years after Chavín and with no knowledge of its design, can independently converge on very similar stacking choices simply by paying careful attention to what makes the effect reliable versus unreliable. Convergent rediscovery is exactly what one would expect if the underlying mechanism is real and discoverable by any sufficiently attentive practitioner. Its absence would be a serious problem for the framework. Its presence, which the case study in Part 2, Section 2.7 will document in detail, is confirmation. 3 registers of claim. The traditions we are about to examine make claims that operate at 3 distinct levels of certainty, and this book will preserve the distinction between them throughout. I want to be explicit about the framework because it is what allows the book to take extraordinary claims seriously without either dismissing them or asserting them naively. The first register is established. Claims at this register have direct empirical support: archaeological, chemical, physiological, or documentary. The 2025 identification of San Pedro and Vilca residues on the Chavín consumption tubes, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, is an established claim. The 110 Hz hemispheric shift effect of the Prututu conch trumpets, documented by the University of California, Los Angeles archaeoacoustic study, is an established claim. The clinical efficacy of open-label placebo in irritable bowel syndrome, documented in the Kapchuk and Lembo trials, is an established claim. The pharmacological activity of ibogaine at the alkaloid level is an established claim. Established does not mean beyond further investigation, and it does not mean beyond the possibility of revision. It means that the current empirical evidence is sufficient that a serious researcher would accept the claim as a working premise for further work. Claims at this register have substantial evidence but have not reached scholarly consensus, or have evidence that supports the general form of the claim without settling the specifics. The botanical identity of Soma is contested. The specific ergot species responsible for the alkaloid content of the Eleusinian Kykeon is contested, though a 2026 study from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens has narrowed the range of viable candidates substantially by demonstrating that the ergot to psychedelic drink conversion is achievable using methods available in classical antiquity. The exact ritual sequence at Chavín is contested. Claims at this register will be presented in this book with their contestation flagged explicitly and with the state of the evidence described honestly. Contested does not mean baseless. It means the work is not yet finished. The third register is story. Claims at this register operate at the level of first-person report, describing what a participant experienced during a ritual. When Sahagun's Nahua informants describe the visions produced by Tionanacatl, when Maria Sabina describes the wise language that spoke through her during the Velada, when a Bwiti initiate describes the encounter with the ancestors during the Iboga ceremony, when a contemporary practitioner describes seeing rainbow light emanating from another person's body under LSD. These are claims at the story register. I want to say something specific about how they will be handled in this book because it matters. They will not be dismissed as hallucination. The word hallucination prejudges the metaphysics of the experience, by asserting that the participant perceived something that was not there. That prejudgment is not warranted by the evidence. It is a philosophical commitment dressed up as a scientific one. Nor will these claims be asserted as literal reports of external fact in the naive sense. The book will not, for example, take a position on whether the entities that Maria Sabina reported speaking through her have an existence independent of her nervous system. What the book will do is preserve the first-person report in its specificity, treat it as phenomenological data about what happens to human consciousness under specific ritual conditions, and connect it where possible to the modern research that illuminates the neural mechanisms involved. the academic tradition that has developed the sophisticated tools for this kind of treatment, from William James's Varieties of Religious Experience through the contemporary work of Ann Taves at UC Santa Barbara, provides the methodological grounding. Because it applies to something the book does that most academic treatments of these traditions do not. In Part 2, Section 2.7, this book takes seriously the manuscript of a contemporary practitioner who has independently developed a ritual protocol closely paralleling the design principles documented in the historical case studies. The practitioner's manuscript makes claims that operate across all three registers I have just described. Some of the claims are established: the effects of specific frequencies on cognitive state, the effect of fasting on psychedelic intensity, the effects of small group size on interpersonal synchrony. Some are contested: claims about specific correspondences between musical notes and chakra activation, for instance, which have partial support in the literature on binaural entrainment, but have not been systematically tested. And some are story claims about telepathic linking between trip partners, about entity contact, about the visual perception of colored auras and multi-lifetime facial morphology under high-dose LSD. All three registers will be preserved. The story register claims will be reported in their first-person specificity, treated as phenomenological data, and set alongside the closest available modern research on the neural correlates of the reported experience. Nothing will be flattened. Nothing will be uncritically asserted. This is, I want to insist, the same treatment academic religious studies gives to the phenomenological reports of Sabina or the Bwiti initiates. Applying it to a contemporary practitioner is not a departure from scholarly rigor. It is an extension of scholarly rigor to material that scholars have not previously considered. With the framework established, we can now turn to the traditions themselves. We will begin where the evidence is most complete, in the Peruvian Andes, 3,000 years ago, in a temple complex built to change the minds of anyone who entered it. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script Part 1, 11 Part 2, 6 Reconstructive Case Studies, 2.1, Chavín de Huántar, the first machine for changing minds. You approach it from the east, walking up the valley of the Mosna River in the north-central Peruvian Andes. The mountains close in around you. To your right, the Cordillera Negra rises dry and dark. To your left, the Cordillera Blanca lifts into permanent snow. Where the Mosna meets the Huachixa, at an elevation of 3,150 meters, the valley widens just enough to hold a small ceremonial complex of stone platforms and sunken plazas that a modern eye would not immediately recognize as one of the most important religious sites in the pre-Columbian Americas. There is nothing here that resembles a cathedral. The exteriors are severe, gray, mostly reclaimed by earth and grass. Small rectangular openings pierce the walls at intervals, showing only darkness within. If you did not know what to look for, you might mistake the site for a well-preserved but architecturally modest ruin of the sort that exists in dozens of Andean valleys. You would be looking at it wrong. Chavín de Huántar is not a modest ruin. It is the exterior of an enormous machine, most of which is underground, and the machine was engineered with a specific purpose: to reliably transform the consciousness of any pilgrim who walked into it. The machine was active for something like 700 years, from roughly 900 BCE to 200 BCE, which makes it older than the Parthenon, and roughly contemporary with the composition of the Rigveda on another continent. During those 7 centuries, pilgrims came to Chavín from as far away as 500 kilometers, crossing mountain passes and river valleys, bringing offerings of spondylus shells and obsidian from distant coastal and jungle regions. They came because Chavín did something to them. When they went home, they took the memory of what had happened to them, and they took a specific religious iconography: the fanged deities, the human feline serpent transformations, the mucus-streaming heads that we now recognize as depictions of psychedelic states, and they seeded that iconography across an area of the Andes so large that archaeologists refer to the resulting cultural pattern as the Chavín horizon. This was one of the first pan-regional religious phenomena in the New World, and it spread without any evidence of military conquest. Chavín drew its influence by drawing pilgrims and sending them home changed. What did it do to them? Until very recently, we could only reason from the archaeological evidence about what the ritual sequence must have been. We could see the labyrinth of galleries. We could see the iconography of what looked like plant-induced altered states. We could see the strange acoustic properties of the underground corridors when we walked through them. We could see the Strombus shell trumpets recovered from a sealed chamber. What we could not do until 2025 was prove chemically that specific psychoactive plants had been consumed at the site during the active ritual period. In April of that year, a team led by John Rick of Stanford University, who has directed excavations at Chavín since 1995, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences reporting the results of microbotanical and chemical analyses of 23 artifacts recovered from a sealed underground gallery. The artifacts included bone tubes of the sort used elsewhere in the Andean region for the consumption of psychoactive snuffs. The residues on the tubes contained direct evidence of two specific psychoactive plants: San Pedro cactus, Trichocereus pachanoi, also called wachuma, and Vilca, Anadenanthera colubrina, a DMT-containing tree whose seeds have been used as a psychoactive snuff across the region for at least 4,000 years. This is not a small finding. It moves the central claim about Chavín, that the site was a locus of ritualized psychedelic experience, from strongly inferred to directly confirmed. Everything else that follows in this chapter builds on that confirmation. We now know what plants were being administered. We can begin to work out, with more confidence than was previously possible, what the ritual was doing to the people who received them. The primary sources, what we actually have. There is no written record from Chavín. The culture that built the site was pre-literate, or at least left no writing that has survived. What we have instead falls into three categories. The first category is the site itself, which has been excavated continuously by teams of Peruvian and international archaeologists for most of a century. The current excavation program, directed by Rick as part of the Programa de Investigación Arqueológica y Conservación Chavín de Huántar, PIACDH, has produced the most detailed architectural mapping to date, including the identification of previously unknown gallery sections, the tracing of the hydraulic canal system, and the recovery of the bone tubes that would eventually yield the 2025 chemical evidence. The archaeological record includes the U-shaped old temple built in the earliest construction phase around 900 BCE, the sunken circular plaza in front of it, the new temple added around 500 BCE, and the elaborate network of underground galleries that honeycomb the interior of both structures. The Lanzón monolith, a 4.5-meter carved granite blade depicting a fanged anthropomorphic deity, still stands in situ at the intersection of a cruciform gallery in the deepest part of the old temple, where it has stood for approximately 3,000 years without being moved. The second category is the iconography, carved into the exterior walls, the interior corridors, and the freestanding stelae. The most famous piece is the Lanzón itself, but the site also contains the Raimondi stela, the Tello obelisk, and a large number of tenon stone heads, cabezas clavas, that originally lined the exterior walls of the new temple. These heads are particularly important for the argument I am making in this chapter, because they depict what appear to be specific stages of a psychedelic experience. The extreme grimaces, the upturned eyes, the trails of nasal mucus streaming from the nostrils, these are not stylized decorations. They are recognizable representations of the physiological signatures of Vilca snuff use, which produces a characteristic runny nose alongside its psychoactive effects. The people who carved these heads had seen what they were carving. They were documenting the experience. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 13. The third category is the growing body of archaeoacoustic research on the site. Carried out since 2007, as a collaboration between the PIACCDH excavation team and Stanford University's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, CCRMA. Led principally by Miriam Kolar, with Perry Cook and Jonathan Abel. The Archaeoacoustics program has done systematic acoustic measurement of the underground galleries, psychoacoustic experiments on how listeners perceive sound in those spaces, and detailed performance experiments with replicas of the Strombus conch trumpets recovered from a sealed gallery in 2001. The findings of this program are what allow us to reconstruct with meaningful specificity what the acoustic environment of the ritual would have been like. Between these three categories, the physical site, the iconography, the acoustic measurements, we have enough evidence to reconstruct a plausible ritual sequence in real detail. The 2025 chemistry paper is what added the missing ingredient, confirmation of what was actually being consumed. With all of that in hand, we can begin the reconstruction. The pharmacology, San Pedro and Vilca. San Pedro is a tall, columnar cactus native to the Andes, where it grows abundantly at elevations between 2,000 and 3,000 meters, including in the immediate vicinity of Chavín de Huántar, where the cactus can be seen growing wild among the ruins today. It is one of the oldest documented psychoactive plants in the Americas. Pollen from the cactus has been recovered from Guitarrero Cave in the Kykeon de Huaylas Valley, dated to between 6,800 and 6,200 BCE, meaning that human interaction with San Pedro in this region predates the Chavín ritual center by more than 4,000 years. The primary psychoactive compound in San Pedro is mescaline, a phenethylamine that acts as a partial agonist at serotonin 5-HT2A receptors and produces effects that overlap substantially with those of psilocybin and LSD, though with a longer duration. A typical San Pedro experience lasts between 8 and 12 hours, compared to 4 to 6 hours for the tryptamines. The traditional Andean preparation of San Pedro is neither casual nor quick. The cactus is sliced into thick discs, then boiled for 5 to 7 hours in water, sometimes with other adjunct plants added to the brew. The resulting liquid is a viscous green tea, bitter and difficult to drink, which is consumed in the setting of a ritual ceremony under the guidance of a specialist called a huachumero or maestro. Traditional use continues to the present day, particularly in the Huarangas region of northern Peru, where lineages of huachumero practice have persisted despite 400 years of colonial and post-colonial suppression. The ritual context of contemporary huachuma use provides one of the most important lines of evidence for reconstructing what the ancient Chavín ceremony was like, because the practice is essentially unbroken. What the contemporary huachumero does is not identical to what the Chavín priest was doing 3,000 years ago, but it is close enough that the differences are informative and the continuities are diagnostic. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 14. Vilca is a different animal. The Vilca tree, Anadenanthera colubrina, produces seed pods containing seeds rich in the tryptamine alkaloids, bufotenin, DMT, and 5-MeO-DMT. Traditional preparation involves roasting the seeds and grinding them into a fine powder, which is then administered as a snuff, typically blown into the nose of the recipient by another person using a bird bone tube of exactly the sort recovered from the Chavín galleries and analyzed in the 2025 paper. Vilca is fast-acting and intense, where San Pedro produces a long, slow, expansive experience. Vilca produces a rapid, overwhelming, dissociative experience that peaks within minutes and resolves within an hour. The two compounds are not typically used interchangeably. They are used in traditions where both are known for different purposes. The 2025 chemistry paper found residues of both plants on artifacts recovered from the same sealed gallery. This is telling. It suggests that the Chavín ritual involved not one, but two distinct pharmacological interventions, potentially at different points in the ceremonial sequence, potentially with distinct roles in the overall trajectory of the experience. We cannot yet say for certain how the two were sequenced, or whether a given pilgrim received both, or whether the two were reserved for different classes of participant. What we can say is that the ritual designers had access to two different psychoactive tools and used them both. This is consistent with a level of pharmacological sophistication that the pre-2025 literature had not yet been willing to attribute to the Chavín practitioners. The sensory engineering, 4 channels working in concert. Here is where the choir principle from Part 1 stops being a theoretical claim and becomes a concrete description of what the Chavín architects were doing. When the pilgrim, having consumed the San Pedro brew and possibly received the Vilca snuff, entered the underground galleries, the architects had prepared 4 distinct sensory channels to work on the pilgrim's altered consciousness. Each channel was doing independent causal work. Each channel has now been documented and in some cases systematically measured by modern archaeoacoustic research. The 4 channels are sound, water, light, and spatial disorientation. I am going to describe each in turn, and then describe what happens when all 4 are operating simultaneously on a mescaline-intoxicated participant in the pitch-dark, 40 feet underground. Sound. The most extensively studied of the 4 channels is the acoustic environment, which the Stanford CCRMA Archaeoacoustics program has been mapping since 2008. The primary instruments were the patutus, Strombus galeatus conch shell trumpets, recovered in a group of 20 from a sealed gallery excavation in 2001. These are large, heavy, decorated shells, originally sourced from the tropical Pacific coast far to the west of the Andean highlands. Brought to Chavín through long-distance trade networks and modified with drilled mouthpieces to be played as horns. When blown, the patutus produce a resonant, sustained tone with strong, low-frequency content and complex harmonic structure. Miriam Kolar's psychoacoustic fieldwork with replicas of the recovered instruments has documented several remarkable effects when these trumpets are played inside the Chavín galleries. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 115. The first effect is what acousticians call auditory localization confusion. In an ordinary environment, the human brain uses tiny differences in the arrival time and intensity of sound between the 2 ears to determine where a sound is coming from. This works well because in most environments sound travels in something close to a straight line from source to listener. In the Chavín galleries, sound does not travel in a straight line. The corridors are narrow, mostly stone-walled, and connected by right-angle turns and shifting height ceilings that function as complex acoustic waveguides. A patutu blown in one gallery is reflected, refracted, and channeled through the corridor system in ways that make it very difficult for a listener elsewhere in the labyrinth to determine where the sound is originating. Kolar's controlled experiments with volunteer participants have documented that listeners standing in certain areas of the galleries wildly misidentify the source direction of sounds played from known locations elsewhere in the network. The architecture was doing something specific to auditory perception. It was making sound come from everywhere and from nowhere simultaneously. The second effect involves the acoustic properties of the specific frequency range produced by the patutus, which centers around 110 Hz. In 2008, a research group at the University of California, Los Angeles, published a study documenting that listening to a resonant tone in this frequency range temporarily shifts the balance of neural activity from the logic processing left hemisphere of the brain to the emotional right hemisphere. The shift is measurable with EEG. It is not a small effect. It happens reliably in participants who have no prior expectation of it, which means it cannot be dismissed as a placebo response. It is a direct physical effect of the acoustic input on cortical processing. Now consider what this means at Chavín. The pilgrims were being exposed in the underground galleries to sustained tones in a frequency range that we now know produces a shift toward right hemisphere dominance. They were being exposed to those tones from unlocatable directions, which the vestibular and orienting systems of the brain would have registered as further evidence that the ordinary rules of perception were breaking down. And they were being exposed while their serotonin 5-hydroxytryptamine 2A receptors were being agonized by mescaline. The pharmacological effect of the plant, the neurological effect of the frequency, and the perceptual effect of the disorienting spatial acoustics were all working simultaneously on the same nervous system. This is the choir principle in operation. There is a third acoustic effect, more speculative but strongly suggested by both the physical evidence and Kolar's more recent work, the possibility that the Lanzan monolith itself could speak. The Lanzan stands in a cruciform chamber at the intersection of several gallery corridors. The top of the monolith pierces the ceiling of the chamber and enters a small gallery on the level above. A priest positioned in that upper gallery could deliver speech through the aperture, which the acoustic properties of the chamber below would then transform into a resonant, distributed sound apparently emanating from the deity itself. The physical arrangement is consistent with this interpretation. Whether or not the Chavín ritual involved a deliberately staged oracle, the possibility is architecturally available, and the surrounding acoustic engineering suggests strongly that it was used. Water. The second sensory channel is hydraulic. The Chavín architects built an elaborate system of underground stone canals with precisely graded floors running throughout and beneath the temple complex. When water was diverted from the rivers into these channels, the resulting sound of rushing water filled the galleries in ways that varied with the volume and speed of the flow. Some canals ran beneath the pilgrims' feet. Others ran overhead. In certain locations, the acoustic amplification produced by the canal geometry was engineered to mimic the sound of a jaguar's roar. And this is the striking part. That engineered roar was located directly beneath sections of the temple, where jaguar iconography is carved into the walls above. The visual depiction of the deity and the sonic embodiment of the deity were spatially co-located. The pilgrim under the influence of mescaline, walking through a corridor with a jaguar carved into the stone at eye level, would have simultaneously heard what sounded exactly like a jaguar roaring from beneath the floor. This is not accidental. This is not decorative. This is deliberate multi-channel messaging designed to make the deity present in more than one sensory modality at once. Light. The third channel is optical. For most of their length, the underground galleries would have been in near total darkness. Small ventilation shafts admitted narrow beams of natural light at specific locations, which the architects used to selectively illuminate specific carvings at specific moments in the ritual sequence. Polished coal mirrors, examples of which have been recovered from the excavations, could redirect the light beams to produce localized illumination in otherwise dark chambers. Torches carried by the pilgrims or by the ritual attendants would have flickered constantly, because the ventilation shafts created intermittent airflow that made stable flames impossible in certain corridors. What all of this adds up to is an optical environment characterized by long periods of total darkness punctuated by sudden and dramatic reveals. A shaft of light suddenly illuminating a carved deity. The polished mirror reflecting light onto the face of the pilgrim. The flickering torch making a stone face appear to move. Under mescaline, in the middle of the labyrinth, these effects would not have been perceived as staged theater. They would have been perceived as evidence that the ordinary world was giving way to something else. Spatial disorientation. The fourth channel is the maze itself. The Chavín galleries constitute roughly 2 kilometers of interconnected corridors on multiple levels, with at least 36 identified tunnels. Passages between 3 and 6 feet wide, some sections plunging more than 40 feet below the surface, and right-angle turns and shifting alcoves that make it nearly impossible to maintain a coherent mental map of one's location within the system. The labyrinth was not designed for practical use. Its design has no functional necessity. The volumes could have been enclosed in a much simpler and more accessible plan if utility had been the priority. The design was engineered to disorient. A participant walked into the maze, was led through corridors that folded back on themselves, and back turned into the maze, lost track of direction and depth, and eventually arrived at a chamber that they could not from their disoriented state, have located again on their own. The interpretive climax was the encounter with the Lanzan. Its impact depended entirely on the disorientation that preceded it. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 17. Now consider what happens when all 4 channels are operating simultaneously. The pilgrim, having fasted for some period before the ritual, is led through the initial galleries in near darkness. The mescaline from the San Pedro brew is coming on gradually, over the course of 60 to 90 minutes from ingestion. So the initial descent happens during the anticipatory phase. As the mescaline reaches full effect, the pilgrim is guided deeper into the labyrinth. The pututus begin to sound from unlocatable directions. The water canals thunder from beneath the floor. The torch flickers as the ventilation shifts. Right angles turn into right angles, turn into right angles, until the pilgrim has completely lost track of where they are. And then, in a chamber they could not have imagined, a shaft of light suddenly illuminates a fanged granite deity, 4.5 meters tall, and a voice speaks from above the deity's head, seemingly from the deity itself, in a language and a cadence that the pilgrim has been prepared for years to receive. The pharmacology is doing its work. The acoustics are doing their work. The optics are doing their work. The disorientation is doing its work. Nothing about the ritual is decorative. Every element has been engineered. If this sounds like a scene from a movie, that is because the modern conventions of immersive experience, the cathedral, the cinema, the museum's darkened gallery, the psychedelic clinic with its carefully designed light and sound, all descend, functionally if not lineally, from what Chavín was doing 3,000 years ago. Chavín was the prototype. What we have built in the intervening millennia are less sophisticated variations on the same design principle. The reconstructed ritual sequence. We can now put the whole thing together. What follows is a reconstruction, which means it is a defensible narrative built from the archaeological, chemical, and acoustic evidence, but it is not a transcription. Details will be revised as new evidence emerges. The general shape, however, is now well supported. A prospective pilgrim, hearing accounts of Chavín from travelers or visiting priests, decided to make the journey. Depending on where they lived, the trip could take weeks and cross mountain passes that would have been physically demanding at minimum and life-threatening at worst. The pilgrimage itself was the first component of the ritual. Long-distance walking under conditions of physical hardship is a well-documented set and setting intervention in traditions worldwide, because it functions as an extended expectancy period that focuses attention on the coming experience and dissolves the ordinary concerns of the participant's daily life. Kapchuk's decomposition of the placebo response places substantial weight on the assessment and observation phase. A pilgrimage of days or weeks is that phase extended to a scale that no contemporary clinical trial has ever attempted. Arrival at Chavín would have been followed by a period of ceremonial preparation, probably including fasting, which is documented in the general Andean ritual tradition, and which would have both intensified the effect of the plant medicines and increased the participants' suggestibility to the ritual container. The specific duration of the pre-ritual fast, the Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 18, at Chavín, is not known, but the practice of fasting before consuming San Pedro is uniformly attested in the contemporary Huachumero tradition, where fasts of 12 to 24 hours are standard, and longer preparations of several days are used for particularly significant ceremonies. At the appointed moment, the pilgrim would have received the San Pedro brew, probably administered by a specialist within a ceremonial context that emphasized the significance of what was about to occur. If the Vilca snuff was administered as well, and the 2025 chemistry paper strongly suggests it was, this may have happened either concurrently or at a specific later point in the sequence, most likely as a sudden dissociative escalation at a critical moment. The timing of Vilca administration matters because the compound acts within minutes, meaning that its administration could have been used to produce a sharp intensification of the experience at a chosen point, rather than gradually across the whole ceremony. The onset of the San Pedro would have begun within 30 to 60 minutes. During this onset phase, the pilgrim was likely led into the initial galleries, still ambulatory, but with attention increasingly turned inward. The near darkness of the underground environment, the confined dimensions of the corridors, and the beginning of the acoustic interventions, the first sustained tones from the purutus in the distance, would have marked the transition from ordinary consciousness to the ritual container. The pilgrim would have understood, at some level, that they were now in a place where the ordinary rules did not apply. Peak intoxication would have been reached deep in the labyrinth. This is where the choir was fully operational. Purutus from unlocatable directions, water thundering above and below, torchlight flickering off stone faces that appeared to move, right-angle turns dissolving all sense of orientation, and then at the climax, the sudden reveal of the Lanzone, the fanged deity illuminated by a single shaft of light, speaking with the voice of a hidden priest above, apparently answering questions the pilgrim had brought from days or weeks away. The pilgrim, in this moment, was not experiencing a religious performance. The pilgrim was experiencing what any human nervous system under the same combined interventions would experience: direct encounter with the deity, in a form that felt overwhelmingly real, because at the level of what the brain was actually doing, it was overwhelmingly real. The mescaline had opened cortical processing to states of consciousness normally inaccessible. The acoustics had shifted hemispheric dominance. The disorientation had stripped away the ordinary orientational scaffolding. The interpretive framework, carried in from years of collective preparation, had provided the meaning structure into which the encounter could resolve. The resolution phase would have lasted for hours after the peak, gradually returning the pilgrim to ordinary consciousness. During this phase, the interpretation of what had happened would have been shaped by the priests and by other pilgrims who had made the journey. The meaning-response mechanisms Kapchuk has documented in clinical settings would have been operating at full intensity here, because the pilgrim was in a state of maximum suggestibility and was surrounded by trained interpreters whose entire role was to help the experience integrate into a coherent narrative. In modern psychedelic therapy vocabulary, it is not a modern innovation. It was built into the Chavín ritual 3,000 years ago. The pilgrim eventually left Chavín and traveled home, carrying the memory of what had happened, and carrying the iconography and religious framework that would spread the Chavín cult across the Andean world. This is how a religious center of a few hundred permanent inhabitants became the founding cultural event of what archaeologists call the Chavín Horizon. The site did not conquer, it converted, one nervous system at a time, using a ritual technology so precisely engineered that the resulting religious transformation was reliable enough to sustain a pan-regional cultural phenomenon for 700 years. What modern research confirms? I want to be specific about what the modern research literature has actually established versus what remains open, because this is the pattern I want to apply consistently throughout the book. The Chavín case is the anchor case, precisely because more of it has now been established than for any of the other historical traditions we will examine. At the established register, we now have direct chemical confirmation of San Pedro and Vilca consumption at the site during the active ritual period. We have detailed archaeoacoustic measurements of the underground galleries showing that the corridors function as complex acoustic waveguides with documented effects on auditory localization. We have the 110 Hz hemispheric shift research from UCLA that provides a specific neurophysiological mechanism for how the pututu frequencies would have affected participant cognition. We have the physical presence of the hydraulic canal system, the polished coal mirrors, the ventilation shafts, and the labyrinth architecture itself. We have the Lanzone monolith in its cruciform chamber with its aperture into the upper gallery. And we have the iconography of the cabezas clavas depicting recognizable signatures of psychedelic states. All of these are established in the sense that they have direct empirical support and are widely accepted in the current scholarly literature. At the contested register, we have the exact ritual sequence, which the archaeological evidence constrains but does not determine. We have the specific role of the Vilca, whether it was administered to all participants or only to certain classes of initiate, whether it was concurrent with the San Pedro or sequential to it, whether its administration marked a specific ritual moment. We have the question of whether the Lanzone was actually used as a speaking oracle, which is architecturally plausible but has not yet been experimentally demonstrated with the specific acoustic properties of the chamber. We have questions about who exactly had access to which parts of the ritual. The relationship between the pilgrims, the resident priesthood, and the surrounding population is only partially understood. These are matters of ongoing research. They are not baseless speculation, but they are also not yet settled. At the story register, we have the phenomenological reports that would have described what the pilgrims actually experienced. Because Chavín is pre-literate, we do not have these reports in the pilgrims' own words. What we have instead are the depictions in the iconography, which show human figures undergoing transformations into feline, avian, and serpentine forms. The mucus-streaming faces of the cabezas clavas, the fanged deities, with claw-tipped hands and serpent hair. These are visual reports of what the ritual was producing in participant consciousness. They are not to be dismissed as artistic license. They are to be treated as phenomenological data, the same way the reports of Maria Sabina's Velada, or the Buiti initiation encounters, will be treated in later chapters. What they document is that the ritual was producing experiences of shapeshift, of encounter with entities that combined animal and human characteristics, of transformation from one state of being into another. That is what the pilgrims were reporting, in the medium available to them. It is consistent with what modern participants under mescaline in comparable ritual settings continue to report. The consistency across 3,000 years and radically different cultural framings is itself evidence that the ritual was producing a specific class of experience reliably. What Chavín establishes for the rest of the book. Chavín matters to this book for reasons that extend beyond its own historical significance. It matters because it is the case study where the framework laid out in Part 1 can be applied with the most confidence. The pharmacology is chemically confirmed. The architectural interventions are physically extant and measurable. The acoustic engineering has been documented by contemporary scientific research. The specific neural mechanisms recruited by the acoustic interventions have been characterized in modern laboratories. Every element of the Kapchuk decomposition, the extended expectancy period, the therapeutic ritual, the trained interpretive relationship, is present in the ritual sequence. Every element of the choir principle is stacked deliberately and simultaneously. The whole apparatus works together as a design system. If Chavín were the only case, we could argue that we had identified one impressive but idiosyncratic ancient ritual technology. It is not the only case. The subsequent chapters of Part 2 will show that the same fundamental design principles were being applied, with local variations, in the Eleusinian Mysteries in Greece, in the Vedic Soma sacrifice in India, in the Mazatec Velada in Oaxaca, in the Buiti Iboga initiation in Gabon, and in the Aztec Teonanacatl ceremony documented in the Florentine Codex. 6 independent cultures on 4 continents converged on similar element stacking. That is not diffusion. That is not chance. That is discovery, the discovery of design principles for the deliberate transformation of human consciousness that work regardless of which culture is doing the discovering, because they are recruiting the same underlying neural mechanisms. And that is why the modern case documented in Part 2, Section 2.7 is important. If the design principles are real and discoverable, then a modern practitioner working carefully with contemporary psychedelic tools and paying close attention to what makes the experience reliable should, given enough iteration, converge on the same principles. Not through cultural transmission from any of the historical traditions, but through independent rediscovery. That is exactly what the modern case documents. But we will get to that. First, we need to visit Eleusis. 2.2. The Eleusinian Mysteries, 9 days on the sacred way. For nearly 2,000 years, longer than the Christian Church has existed, and by a substantial margin, thousands of people walked 21 kilometers each autumn, from Athens to a small coastal town called Eleusis. They came from every stratum of Greek society: farmers, slaves, philosophers, generals, Roman emperors. They came without regard for social status, because the mysteries were among the few institutions in classical Greek life where status did not matter. Anyone who spoke Greek and had not committed murder could be initiated, women alongside men, slaves alongside citizens, on payment of a fee of approximately 15 drachmas, about 10 days' wages, which meant that participation required some real commitment, but was not impossibly restricted. They walked in a great procession, singing and shouting, swinging branches called bakshoi, calling out the name Ayaka over and over until it filled the road. When they arrived at Eleusis, they fasted for a day. Then they drank a barley-based potion called Kykeon, entered a torchlit hall called the Telesterion, and experienced something inside that hall that they were sworn on pain of death never to describe. What was it? For most of the last century, the answer given by classical scholarship was some version of "we do not know, and cannot know, and probably never will." The initiates kept the vow. Pindar wrote of Eleusis in guarded, elusive terms. Sophocles did the same. Plato did the same. Even Marcus Aurelius, as emperor, participated in the rites and gave no clear account of what happened inside. The Christian polemicists of late antiquity, who had every incentive to expose the mysteries as pagan fraud, produced only fragments that scholars have long treated as unreliable. Aristotle preserved the most tantalizing line of the whole ancient corpus, passed down through Synesius. The initiates were not intended to learn anything, but to suffer something. To suffer something, not to be taught, not to be shown a doctrine, but to undergo an experience so intense that the participant emerged transformed. What was that experience? In 1978, a book was published that gave the first serious modern answer. The authors were R. Gordon Wasson, the ethnomycologist who had documented the Mazatec mushroom ceremony with María Sabina in 1955. Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who had synthesized LSD from ergot alkaloids in 1938. And Carl A. P. Ruck, a classicist at Boston University who specialized in the ecstatic rituals of Dionysus. The book was The Road to Eleusis, Unveiling the Secret of the Mysteries, and its central proposal was as follows. The Kykeon, as described in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, was a mixture of barley, water, and pennyroyal, 3 ingredients that on their own could not produce the effects the ancient sources describe. But barley was subject to infection by a parasitic fungus, Claviceps purpurea, called ergot in English, which produces a family of alkaloids chemically related to lysergic acid diethylamide. Some of those alkaloids are extraordinarily toxic. Others, at appropriate doses, are strongly psychoactive. If the priestesses at Eleusis had discovered a method of separating the psychoactive from the toxic, a method available in principle to anyone with access to boiling water, wood ash, and thyme, the Kykeon could have been the vehicle by which they administered a controlled psychedelic experience to as many as 3,000 initiates a night. This was a bold proposal. It was received badly in some quarters of classical scholarship at the time, embraced enthusiastically in others, and remained unresolved for the next 4.5 decades. Chemical residue analysis had not yet advanced to the point where the specific alkaloid signatures could be recovered from ancient vessels with confidence. The technique had not been experimentally demonstrated. The archaeological record was suggestive but not conclusive. What the ergot hypothesis needed to move from bold speculation to defensible interpretation were 2 things: direct evidence that ergot had actually been consumed in a ritual context connected to the Eleusinian tradition, and experimental demonstration that ancient technology was capable of the required chemical conversion. Both of these came at last in the mid-2020s. The archaeological evidence came first. At Mas Castellar de Pontos, a Greek colonial site in modern Catalonia, active between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE, archaeologists led by Emrique de Pons excavated a domestic sanctuary dedicated to Demeter and Kore, complete with a Hellenistic altar of Pentelic marble imported from Greece itself. The archaeobotanist Jordi Juan Tresserras of the University of Barcelona identified fragments of ergot sclerotia, the dormant stage of the fungus, in a ceremonial vessel from the sanctuary, and remarkably, in the dental calculus of a 25-year-old man buried at the site. This is direct evidence that ergot was being consumed by an individual in a Demeter-Kore ritual context in the Hellenistic period. It is not evidence that ergot was consumed at Eleusis specifically, but Mas Castellar was a satellite of the same tradition, and its practitioners were, quite literally, importing altar stone from the Greek mainland. What they were doing was what they had been taught to do by the tradition that had its center at Eleusis. Then, in February 2026, a research team led by Romanos Antonopoulos and Evangelos Dodiotis at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens published a paper in Scientific Reports demonstrating experimentally that the required chemical conversion is achievable using only ancient technology. They pulverized ergot sclerotia. They boiled the powder for 2 hours in a lye solution, pH 12.5, easily achieved by dissolving wood ash in water, a mixture that would have been trivially available to any ancient Greek household. The result? Approximately 0.54 milligrams of lysergic acid amide, LSA, and 0.48 milligrams of iso-LSA per gram of ergot, with the toxic ergopeptines destroyed by the process. These doses fall within the range that produces altered states of consciousness. The chemistry works. Using materials and methods available to the priestesses of Eleusis, ergot can be converted into a controlled psychedelic sacrament. This does not prove that the priestesses actually did this. It does prove that they could have. Combined with the Mas Castellar evidence, the case for the ergot hypothesis is now substantially stronger than it was when The Road to Eleusis was published. It is not yet at the level of established fact that we have for Chavín, where the 2025 PNAS paper provided direct chemical confirmation. But we now have direct evidence of ergot consumption in a Demeter-Kore ritual context, and we have experimental demonstration that ancient methods could produce a psychoactive preparation from ergot. The two together move the ergot hypothesis from contested speculation to well-supported working theory. I am going to proceed on that basis. Where a specific claim in what follows depends on the ergot hypothesis being correct, I will flag it explicitly. Where the claim would stand on any interpretation of the Kykeon, I will say so. What actually happened during the mysteries? The full ritual cycle at Eleusis stretched across an entire year, though the intensive part unfolded over 9 days each autumn, in the month called Bodromion, which corresponded to roughly mid-September through mid-October in the modern calendar. The initiation itself was preceded by preliminary rites called the Lesser Mysteries, held at a site called Agrai on the Ilissos stream outside Athens in the month of Telesterion, roughly February-March. No one could be initiated at the Greater Mysteries who had not first completed the Lesser. What this meant, in the everyday reality of participants, was that anyone attending the autumn ceremony had already been preparing for at least 6 months, had already made specific ritual commitments, had already been placed in a specific cognitive and social relationship to the mysteries. The autumn ritual was not the beginning of the experience. It was the culmination of a much longer arc of preparation. This is the Kapchuk assessment and observation phase, extended to a scale that no modern clinical trial has ever attempted. The 9-day sequence of the Greater Mysteries began on Bodromion 15 with a formal proclamation by the Hierocherics, the Sacred Herald, calling all worthy initiates to gather. The next day was a day of purification. The initiates walked to the sea at Phaleron and bathed in the water, each of them carrying a young piglet that was bathed with them and later sacrificed. The piglet was symbolic of Persephone descending into the underworld, but the physical act of bathing in cold seawater alongside the animal was also a genuine somatic intervention, one that would have produced an intensified attentional state and marked the transition from ordinary to ritual consciousness in the participant's body. Days followed of further preparatory rites, sacrifices, and communal meals. Some initiates fasted. Some observed specific dietary restrictions. By Bodromion 19, when the great procession from Athens to Eleusis began, the participants had been in an intensified state of ritual attention for 4 days already. The procession itself is the most extensively documented part of the mysteries, because it was public and because thousands of people participated in it. It began at the Keramakos, the Athenian cemetery, and made its way along the Sacred Way, the Hierahodos, which was, until the arrival of the Romans, the only proper road, not a goat path, in all of central Greece. That is how important this procession was. An entire road system was built and maintained specifically to carry the Eleusinian pilgrims. The distance was approximately 21 kilometers, a full day's walk. Along the way, the initiates swung branches called bakchoi, sang and shouted, and at specific locations engaged in ritualized obscene humor, commemorating an episode from the Homeric hymn to Demeter, in which the goddess had been made to smile in her grief by the crude jokes of a woman named Iambe. Throughout the procession they called the name Iacche, sometimes identified with Dionysus, sometimes treated as a distinct figure, either way a name that turned the walk into a chanted invocation that grew louder as more voices joined. The Athenian sources describe the cacophony as extraordinary. Several thousand people walking together in a single direction, singing and shouting the same divine name for hours. The neurological effect of that on the individual participant would have been substantial. Group synchrony research documents elevated oxytocin, altered pain perception, and reduced sense of self-other boundary in individuals participating in extended coordinated group activity. The procession was not a preparation for the ritual. The procession was already part of the ritual. It was producing effects on the pilgrims' nervous systems before they ever arrived at Eleusis. The procession reached Eleusis at nightfall on Bodromion 19. What followed was a day of fasting. The initiates rested at the sanctuary, drank no wine, took no food, and mourned in imitation of Demeter's grief for her lost daughter. This is the second component of Kapchuk's decomposition. The therapeutic ritual proper entered into a state of maximum preparation. It is also a metabolic intervention. A day of fasting after a full day of walking, on top of days of prior dietary preparation, would have produced ketosis in most participants, which is now known to increase the psychedelic effect of many compounds, substantially by shifting the substrate available for neurotransmitter synthesis and by altering the blood-brain barrier's permeability characteristics. The Eleusinian priestesses did not know the biochemistry of this, but they knew empirically that people who had fasted responded more strongly to the Kykeon than people who had eaten. They built the fast into the ritual because it worked. The fast was broken with the Kykeon itself. The formula in the Homeric hymn to Demeter is simple: krithe, barley, water, and glycon, pennyroyal mint. If the ergot hypothesis is correct, and as I have argued above, we now have substantial grounds to think it is, the barley in the ceremonial preparation was not simply ordinary barley, but ergot-infected barley that had been processed by the priestesses to convert the toxic alkaloids into psychoactive ones. The Homeric hymn provides the surface recipe. The full preparation, including whatever chemical processing was involved, was a closely held secret, transmitted within the priestly families that controlled the sanctuary. The pennyroyal, meanwhile, is worth its own note. Pennyroyal is a mild psychoactive in its own right, and is also traditionally used as an emmenagogue and as a mild sedative. Its inclusion in the Kykeon was probably not accidental. Whether it modulated the effect of the ergot alkaloids, or served as a marker ingredient to indicate the ritual preparation, or contributed its own subtle effect, is a matter that further research will need to clarify. The onset of the Kykeon would have been felt within 30 to 60 minutes of consumption. This gave the priestesses time to bring the initiates from the point of drinking, presumably in one of the ancillary buildings of the sanctuary, into the great initiation hall. The hall was called the Telesterion. Inside the Telesterion, at its classical peak, was a nearly square hall, approximately 50 meters on each side. Its roof was supported by 42 columns arranged in 6 rows of 7, and around its perimeter ran stepped tiers of seating cut directly into the bedrock, capable of accommodating up to 3,000 initiates. The design was unlike any other Greek temple. Most Greek temples were designed to be seen from outside, the god's house, with the divine image visible from the exterior through the great doors. The Telesterion was designed to be entered. It had no external emphasis, no significant sculpture on its facade, no public visual program. Everything about it was interior. Everything happened within the hall. What the exterior conveyed was blank stone with a few small entrance apertures. What the interior conveyed was the point of the entire building. At the center of the Telesterion, slightly off-axis from the roof's central lantern, stood a smaller structure called the Anakteron, the palace. This was the innermost sanctum. Only the Hierophant, the chief priest of the mysteries, could enter it. Inside were kept the Hiera, the sacred objects, whose revelation to the initiates constituted the climactic moment of the whole 9-day sequence. The Anakteron had been preserved unchanged for all of the many rebuildings of the sanctuary, meaning that its position and its contents remained constant while everything around it was expanded and modified. The Telesterion evolved around the Anakteron. This is not a small detail. It tells us that whatever was in that innermost chamber, and whatever ritual was performed with it, was the fixed point around which the entire architectural history of Eleusis rotated for 1,000 years. The 42 columns of the classical Telesterion produced an interior effect that modern reconstructions have helped scholars appreciate for the first time. From any given seat on the tiered steps, a substantial fraction of the initiate's field of view was blocked by columns. What the initiate could see was a narrow visual channel that led more or less directly toward the Anakteron at the center. The line of sight was constrained. The visual field was tight, framed, and directed. Anyone sitting in that hall for hours in the dark would have found their attention narrowed to whatever was happening at the center of the space, because the architecture itself gave them very little else to look at. The 3 ancient categories of what happened in the Telesterion, dromena, things enacted, deiknemena, things shown, and legomena, things spoken, are consistently attested but never elaborated on in the surviving sources. What we can reconstruct with reasonable confidence is the following. The initiates entered the hall in near total darkness, probably after nightfall on Bodromion 20, having consumed the Kykeon within the preceding hour or so. They took their places on the tiered seating. The onset of the ergot alkaloids would have been reaching its peak. The priests conducted rites that involved the enactment of specific mythic scenes, most likely the reunion of Demeter and Persephone, the mythic core of the whole tradition, in which the lost daughter is restored to her grieving mother, and the cycle of life is renewed. The initiates witnessed this drama. At some point in the sequence, specific sacred formulas were spoken, and at the climactic moment, the Hierophant emerged from the Anakteron and revealed the Hiera, the sacred objects, to the assembled initiates. Ancient sources give partial hints as to what these objects might have been. Possibly a reaped ear of grain, possibly a stone or a token, possibly the phallic and vulvic symbols that other mystery cults incorporated. Milonis's 1961 monograph reviews the possibilities exhaustively and concludes that we cannot say with certainty. What matters is that at this moment, a sudden light blazed in the previously dark hall. Torches were lit. The revelation happened. Aristotle's fragment about the initiates suffering something points to this moment, the sudden transition from darkness to light, from ordinary vision to what a tradition called the Epoptai, the seeing. This is where the choir principle operates in the Eleusinian ritual with particular clarity. Consider what has been stacked on the participant by this point. The full ritual cycle has been building for at least 6 months since the Lesser Mysteries. The intensive 9-day sequence has produced increasing metabolic and psychological preparation. The procession has generated hours of collective group synchrony with elevated oxytocin. The day of fasting has produced ketosis. The Kykeon has introduced psychoactive alkaloids that are now reaching peak effect. The initiate has entered a dark hall filled with 3,000 other people whose attention is directed at the same point they are looking at. The architectural design has narrowed the visual field. The ritual has enacted the mythic drama of loss and reunion, activating the participants' emotional and empathetic systems. And then, in the middle of all of this, a sudden light. The sacred objects revealed. The Hierophant's voice speaking words that only the initiates would ever hear. The interpretive climax arrives at exactly the moment when every other component of the intervention has been fully engaged. This is the choir at its full volume. This is what suffering something meant, an experience so intense that ordinary categories of thought could not contain it, produced by a designed intervention operating on every accessible neural pathway simultaneously. What happened to the initiates in that moment? We have the guarded testimonies of those who returned. Plutarch, writing centuries later, but drawing on an older tradition, described the experience as mirroring the process of dying. Initial terror and disorientation, followed by a revelation of light, followed by a sense of peace and the promise of renewal. Pindar wrote of Eleusis that, "Blessed is he who, having seen these rites, undergoes the mortal end. He knows the beginning of life granted by the god." Sophocles wrote that those who had witnessed the mysteries were thrice blessed in death. The consistent thread through these accounts is that the initiation dissolved the fear of death. Not intellectually, not doctrinally, existentially. The initiate emerged from the Telesterion with a felt knowledge, a gnosis, that the ordinary categories in which death appears as absolute ending were not the whole truth. Whatever they had seen inside that hall had shown them something else. This is the phenomenological report. It sits at the story register in the framework I laid out in Part 1. It is not to be dismissed as ancient credulity. Modern participants in high-dose psychedelic experiences, particularly in ritual contexts, report the same class of transformation with remarkable consistency across 3,000 years and radically different cultural framings. The Johns Hopkins psilocybin research on end-of-life anxiety in cancer patients has documented, in modern peer-reviewed clinical trials, that a single high-dose psilocybin session in a supportive ritual container reliably reduces death anxiety and produces what participants describe as personally meaningful spiritual experiences. The Eleusinian priestesses were achieving comparable results in comparable participants, using pharmacologically related compounds in a comparably elaborate ritual container 2,500 years earlier. This is not a coincidence. This is the same intervention. The higher grade, Epoptai. There was a second higher level of initiation available to those who returned to Eleusis in a subsequent year. First-time initiates were called Mistai. Those who returned and received the higher initiation were called Epoptai, those who have seen. The distinction indicates that whatever happened in the higher initiation was understood by the tradition as a fuller revelation than what happened in the first initiation. What that fuller revelation consisted of is even more securely hidden than the ordinary mysteries. The sources are guarded to a degree that suggests the Epoptai held a class of experience that was considered even more sacred than what the ordinary initiates received. Some scholars have speculated that the Epoptai received a higher dose of the Kykeon, or a different formulation, or that they were shown additional hyra not revealed to the Mistai. What we can say is that the tradition had a graded progression, that participants deepened their relationship to the ritual over multiple years of return, and that the fullest transformation was reserved for those who had already undergone the initial revelation and returned to seek more. This graded progression is another element that maps directly onto contemporary observations about the value of multiple sessions in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. A single session produces transformation. Repeated sessions in the same tradition, spaced across time, produce deeper and more integrated transformation. The Eleusinian tradition knew this and built it into the ritual structure. The end of the mysteries. The Eleusinian mysteries were suppressed by imperial edict in 392 CE, when the Christian emperor Theodosius I banned pagan rituals throughout the Roman Empire. The Telesterion was destroyed by the Visigoths under Alaric in 396 CE, and the ritual never revived. Nearly 2,000 years of continuous practice ended within a single generation. This is a fact worth marking. The mysteries had persisted through the Persian invasion of Greece, the Peloponnesian War, the Macedonian conquest, the Roman conquest, and every other political upheaval of the ancient Mediterranean world. They persisted because the participants and the surrounding communities considered them essential. What ended them was not political failure or cultural exhaustion. What ended them was a competing religious institution with the power of the state behind it, deliberately suppressing what it saw as a rival source of meaning and authority. The suppression is important for the argument of this book because it establishes something the pattern of loss makes visible. When the Eleusinian tradition ended, it took with it the specific technical knowledge of how the Kykeon was prepared, the choreography of the dromena, the identity of the hieria, and the words of the legomena. That knowledge is not in any surviving text. It was held in the priestly families, transmitted by initiation, and never written down precisely because it was too sacred and too dangerous to write down. When the institution died, the knowledge died with it. What we have been doing for the last century, and what the archaeological chemistry of the 2020s has now materially advanced, is the slow reconstruction of that knowledge from external evidence, from architecture, from iconography, from residue analysis, from experimental chemistry, and from the phenomenological reports of contemporary practitioners under related compounds. The reconstruction is not complete. It is more complete than it was 30 years ago. It will be more complete 30 years from now. Meanwhile, the fact that a religious institution operating for 2 millennia was reliably producing profound transformative experiences in its participants. Using an integrated ritual technology of preparation, procession, fasting, pharmacology, and staged revelation is now established beyond serious doubt. Registers at the established register, we have the Telesterion and its architecture as physically extant, the ritual sequence as documented in multiple ancient sources, the procession route as archaeologically preserved, the hieria as attested but not identified, the ergot chemistry as now experimentally demonstrated, the ergot consumption in Demeter core ritual contexts as documented at Mas Castellar, the transformative effect of the ritual on participants as attested by dozens of ancient authors. At the contested register, we have the specific identity of the Kykeon's active ingredient. The ergot hypothesis is now strongly supported, but not directly confirmed at Eleusis itself. The specific contents of the hieria. The specific sequence of events within the Telesterion during the peak of the ritual. The specific nature of the higher Epoptai. The pharmacological role of the pennyroyal. At the story register we have the direct phenomenological reports of ancient participants describing the loss of the fear of death. The descriptions of terror followed by revelation. Aristotle's account of suffering something transformative. The graded distinction between mystai and epoptai as marking depth of experiential access. And the consistent reports across 2 millennia that whatever happened inside the Telesterion changed the participant in a way that could not be reversed or described. The Eleusinian Mysteries were a functioning cognitive intervention institution for 2,000 years. They were engineered with a level of ritual technology that survives in fragmentary form in the archaeological and textual record. They used a preparation whose chemistry we can now demonstrate is achievable with ancient methods. They produced effects in their participants that are consistent with what modern psychedelic clinical research is now documenting in comparable populations. They deserve to be treated, in the framework of this book, as one of the most successful examples of engineered ecstasy in the recorded history of humanity. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 129. We turn next to India, to a tradition that ran roughly parallel in time, whose central sacrament was also lost, and whose recovery is even more contested. The Vedic Soma. 2.3. The Vedic Soma Sacrifice, the plant, the altar, and the immortality drink. In April of 1975, in a village called Panjal in Kerala, on the southwestern coast of India, a group of Nambudiri Brahmin priests performed a 12-day ritual called the Agnikayana. Fritz Stahl of the University of California at Berkeley was there with a film crew and a team of collaborators, and over the following 8 years, he assembled the most detailed record ever produced of a living Vedic ritual. A 2-volume monograph with tipped-in color photographs, mantras in Devanagari with translation, ritual diagrams, and companion recordings. The Agnikayana Stahl documented was, by his estimate, possibly the oldest continuously transmitted ritual on Earth. Its liturgical framework is preserved in the Krishna Yajurveda, chapters 20 through 25. And its performance requires 17 priests, months of preparation, and the construction of a great falcon-shaped fire altar out of 1,005 specifically shaped bricks laid in 5 layers. Between the years 1900 and 1975, the ritual had been performed only 17 times. The 1975 performance was, when Stahl filmed it, expected to be the last. It was not, in fact, the last. Subsequent performances have taken place, but the tradition is thin. What Stahl captured is a ritual that has been dying for centuries and refuses to finish dying, because in each generation, a small number of Nambudiri families continue to transmit it to their sons. The Agnikayana is a Vedic Soma ritual. That is, at its heart, in the versions that include the Soma sacrifice, the priests press a plant, filter its juice, mix it with milk and curd, and offer it to the fire and to the gods. This is what the priests were doing more than 3,000 years ago when the hymns of the Rigveda were composed, and it is what Nambudiri priests in Kerala were doing in 1975, and continue to do on the increasingly rare occasions when the resources for the full ritual can be assembled. There is one large qualification I have to make immediately. The Soma plant that the Nambudiri priests use in the 21st century is almost certainly not the same Soma plant that the Rigvedic priests used 3,000 years ago. Substitutes were formally prescribed as early as the Brahmana period, a few centuries after the Rigveda's composition, precisely because the original plant had either been lost, become unobtainable, or ceased to grow in the regions where the ritual was being performed. The Sanskrit tradition acknowledges the substitution explicitly. The plant used today may be Sarcostemma brevastigma, or one of several other candidates that fill the ritual role without producing the effects the Rigveda describes. What this means is that the surviving ritual preserves the choreography, the mathematics of the altar, the sequence of the mantras, the offering procedures, the roles of the 17 priests, but not the pharmacology. The choir survives, missing one of its voices. This gives us a rare and useful opportunity. We can study what the ritual technology looks like when the substance component is missing, and we can compare that to what the Rigveda describes when the substance was present. The comparison is illuminating. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1. 30. What the Rigveda says about Soma. The Rigveda is the oldest surviving text in any Indo-European language. Its composition is dated by mainstream scholarship to the 2nd millennium BCE, most likely between 1500 and 1200 BCE. And its transmission through the intervening 3 millennia has been oral, guarded by families of Brahmin reciters who memorized the entire corpus of 10,552 verses with a precision that comparative linguistics has shown to be extraordinary. The text as we have it today is syllable for syllable, essentially what was being recited before writing was introduced to the subcontinent. Of the Rigveda's 10 mandalas, the 9th is dedicated entirely to Soma. All 114 hymns of this mandala are addressed to Soma Pavamana, the purifying Soma, and they describe the plant, its preparation, and its effects in poetic detail that is sometimes maddeningly ambiguous but sometimes remarkably specific. 6 more hymns in other mandalas are also addressed to Soma. This is a substantial fraction of the entire corpus. Soma is not a minor element of the Rigvedic religion. It is one of its central and most exalted subjects. The god Soma, the drink Soma, and the plant Soma appear to be treated in the text as continuous with one another. The plant is the god, the drink is the god is what the priests are consuming. This is not metaphor. It is a specific theological claim about the identity of a plant, a substance, and a divinity. The Rigveda describes the preparation of the drink with enough specificity that any modern reader can reconstruct the procedure. The plant material is placed on pressing stones. It is crushed. The juice is filtered through a sieve of sheep's wool. It is mixed with water, or with milk, or with curd, or with roasted barley. The Rigveda names 4 distinct preparations, each with its own designation. It is offered first to the fire, in oblation to the gods, and then consumed by the priests. The color of the juice is hari, a Sanskrit term that means golden, greenish gold, tawny, and this color word is used so consistently for Soma that it becomes almost an epithet. The plant is fibrous enough to yield significant liquid when pressed. It is described as growing on mountains, brought from far away by a falcon, in the mythic accounts of its origin, Rigveda 968 and elsewhere, which suggests the plant was not native to the plains where the Rigvedic composers live, and had to be traded in from higher elevation regions. The effects of the drink are described in the hymns with a directness that is difficult to interpret as anything other than pharmacological. The most famous verse is Rigveda 848.3, which reads in the standard Griffith translation, "We have drunk Soma and become immortal. We have attained the light. We have found the gods. What can hostility do to us now? And what the malice of mortal man, O immortal one?" The word Amrita, immortal, deathless, is used repeatedly and unambiguously in connection with the consumption of Soma. This is not a symbolic claim about eternal life in an abstract theological sense. The Rigveda's language is more immediate. The drinker has, in the moment of consumption, become deathless. The drinker is now in a state that mortals do not normally inhabit. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 31. Elsewhere the effects are described in physiological terms. Rigveda 10, 119, sometimes called the Soma Drinker's Hymn, is essentially a first-person report by an intoxicated drinker, and it contains lines that any reader of the modern psychedelic literature will recognize immediately. Like violent gusts of wind, the draughts have lifted me up. Have I not drunk of Soma? The draughts I drank have borne me on as fleet-foot horses draw a car. Have I not drunk of Soma? The 5 tribes are no more to me than a mote in the eye. Have I not drunk of Soma? I in my greatness have surpassed the heavens and this vast earth. Have I not drunk of Soma? I will take up the earth and put it here or there. Have I not drunk of Soma? The rising, the elevation, the sense of vast expansion, the dissolution of ordinary scale. This is not the language of a mild ritual intoxicant. This is the language of an intense psychoactive experience, described from inside, with the wonder and slight bewilderment of a person trying to articulate something the ordinary vocabulary was not designed to carry. The identity question. What was the plant? This question has occupied Sanskrit scholarship, ethnobotany, and psychedelic research for more than 2 centuries, and it remains unresolved. The most sustained modern effort was R. Gordon Wasson's 1968 monograph, Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, which proposed that the plant was the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria. Wasson's argument was ingenious and drew on textual details about pressing methods, urine consumption, a well-documented practice with Amanita muscaria in Siberian shamanic traditions, and the mushroom's distinctive red and white appearance. The hypothesis has adherents but has not achieved consensus, and several of its specific claims have been challenged by subsequent scholars. The leading alternative hypothesis, and the one most widely accepted in current Sanskrit scholarship, is that Soma was a species of ephedra, probably Ephedra gerardiana, Ephedra intermedia, or Ephedra equisatina, all of which grow at altitude in Central Asia and contain the stimulant alkaloid ephedrine. The ephedra hypothesis is supported by three converging lines of evidence. First, the linguistic connection. In South and Central Asian languages, ephedra is called som, home, or hum, cognates of the Sanskrit soma and the Avestan haoma, the parallel Iranian tradition in which the same plant is central to Zoroastrian ritual. Second, the botanical fit. Ephedra is a mountain plant with fibrous, jointed green stems that can be pressed for juice, matching the Rigvedic description of the plant's physical characteristics reasonably well. Third, the archaeological evidence. Excavations at Goner Tepe in the Bactria Marjana archaeological complex in modern Turkmenistan have recovered ceramic vessels dated to between 2300 and 1700 BCE, containing residues of ephedra pollen in a ritual context that closely resembles what the Rigveda describes as a soma pressing. The Goner Tepe finds do not prove that the Rigvedic soma was ephedra, but they establish that ephedra was being used ritually in the correct geographical region during the correct time period. The difficulty with the ephedra hypothesis is pharmacological. Ephedrine is a stimulant. It produces alertness, wakefulness, mild euphoria, and increased physical capacity. It does not produce the sort of visionary experience the Rigveda describes at 848.3 or 10.119. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 32. The gap between what ephedra pharmacology can do and what the Rigveda claims soma did has driven a range of secondary hypotheses. Perhaps the Rigvedic soma was ephedra plus an admixture, similar to the way ayahuasca combines Banisteriopsis caapi with a DMT-containing plant to produce effects that neither compound produces alone. Perhaps it was Syrian rue, Paganum harmala, which contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors that could potentiate other compounds. Perhaps Wasson was right about the mushroom after all. Perhaps the immortality language in the Rigveda is more metaphorical than a modern reader would assume. Or perhaps the plant was something else entirely, now lost or unidentified, which is why substitutes were needed as early as the Brahmana period. I am going to leave the botanical question open, because the evidence does not currently permit a confident answer. What matters for the argument of this book is that the Rigveda unambiguously describes a plant preparation that produced a specific altered state of consciousness in the priests who consumed it, and that the ritual around that preparation was engineered with a level of sophistication that we can now examine in detail thanks to the surviving Nambudiri tradition. The altar as cognitive engineering. The Agnikayana is called the piling of the fire altar. The name refers to the central ritual activity, the construction, over 12 days, of a great altar in the shape of a bird. The bird is usually identified as a falcon or an eagle, and it faces east, with wings extended toward the north and south. It is built of 1,005 specially shaped bricks, arranged in 5 layers. Each brick has a specific name, a specific position, and a specific mantra that accompanies its placement. The construction is not decorative. It is understood by the tradition as itself the primary act of the ritual. The Shatapatha Brahmana declares that this fire altar is knowledge, vidya, and it is act, karman. The altar is not a stage on which the ritual takes place. The altar is the ritual. The mathematics of the altar are extraordinary. The Shulba Sutras, ritual manuals dating to the 1st millennium BCE, describe the geometry of the fire altar in explicit mathematical terms. The construction requires solving problems that would later be recognized in Greek geometry as challenging, constructing a square equal in area to a given circle, doubling the area of a square while preserving its shape, transforming a rectangle into a square of equal area, and constructing precise right angles by rope and stake. The Shulba Sutras contain what may be the earliest known statement of the Pythagorean theorem, several centuries before Pythagoras. The Vedic altar builders were doing mathematics as ritual, and doing it well. The Mahavedi, the great altar space within which the Falcon altar is built, is a trapezoid measuring 30 prakrama on the west side, 24 on the east side, and 36 lengthwise. These dimensions sum to 90, which corresponds to 1/4 of the idealized Vedic year of 360 days. This is not coincidence. The altar is being built to encode astronomical time, and the numbers are chosen deliberately so that the construction of the ritual space maps onto the temporal structure of the annual cycle. To the Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script Part 1, 33, the west of the Mahavedi is the Prakinavamsha, a smaller rectangular enclosure containing 3 additional fire altars. The round Garhapatya, or householder's fire, which is the perpetual fire received from the priest's father and transmitted to his descendants. The half-moon-shaped Dakshinagni, or southern fire, and the Ahavaniya, or offering altar. The 3 domestic altars have distinct shapes, distinct positions, and distinct symbolic roles. The whole ritual complex, with the great Falcon altar at its heart, and the 3 fire altars flanking it, is a designed architectural space whose every measurement carries meaning. Consider what this means for the priest and the sacrificer participating in the ritual. They spend 12 days constructing an altar whose geometry encodes the year, whose position in the ritual space encodes cosmological orientation, whose bricks are placed one at a time with specific mantras invoking specific deities, and whose completion is understood to build for the sacrificer an immortal body, the explicit stated purpose of the Agnikayana, as recorded in the Shatapatha Brahmana. This is not casual ritual. This is not decorative religion. This is a designed cognitive intervention in which the participants' attention is directed, through 12 days of continuous engagement, at an act of construction that is simultaneously mathematical, mythic, and, at the ritual's climax, pharmacological. The soma pressing, when it occurs, is embedded in the altar-building sequence. The drink is administered to a participant who has already been prepared by 12 days of intensive ritual attention. Whatever the pharmacology of the original soma may have been, the ritual container into which it was received had been engineered to maximize its effect through every available channel. This is why the persistence of the ritual without the original plant is telling in a specific way. The Nambudiri priests today, using a soma substitute of much reduced potency, still perform the Agnikayana. Participants and observers still report profound experiences during the ritual. Stahl's own account of the 1975 performance describes it as being of substantial religious weight for the priests and the surrounding community. The ritual technology, in other words, produces meaningful effects even when the pharmacology is stripped out. This is exactly what the choir principle predicts. No single voice in the choir is doing what the choir does, and if you remove one voice, the choir is diminished but not silenced. The Nambudiri Agnikayana is the choir with one voice missing. It still functions. If we could put the original voice back, if we could recover the original soma plant, or find a functional equivalent, the ritual would presumably produce effects closer to what the Rigvedic hymns describe. The sonic layer, mantra as cognitive technology. There is one further component of the Vedic ritual technology that deserves specific attention, and that is the sonic layer. The Agnikayana, and Vedic ritual more broadly, is not a silent or ambient practice. The entire 12-day sequence is accompanied by the continuous recitation of Sanskrit mantras, chanted by trained priests in specific meters, at specific pitches, in specific sequences that correspond to specific ritual moments. The Nambudiri tradition has preserved these chanting practices with a precision that has astonished linguists and musicologists who have studied them. The oral transmission of the Rigveda over 3,000 years has produced a text whose recitation has demonstrable acoustic invariance. The pitches, the rhythms, the pauses have been transmitted stably across 100 generations. Sanskrit mantra is not incidental to the ritual. It is another engineered component of the intervention. The specific frequencies of the chanted vowels, the sustained resonance of specific consonants, the rhythmic breathing that mantra recitation requires, and the mental focus that memorized recitation of thousands of verses demands, are all doing work on the participant's nervous system. Contemporary research on chanting practices, including studies of Sanskrit mantra specifically, Gregorian chant, and various indigenous vocal traditions, has documented measurable effects on heart rate variability, autonomic nervous system function, cortisol levels, and default mode network activity. The Vedic tradition did not have this vocabulary, but it had the practice. The sound of the priests chanting, sustained across 12 days, was itself an intervention on the sacrificer's consciousness, working alongside the visual intervention of the altar and the pharmacological intervention of the Soma. If we now apply the framework I established in Part 1 to the Vedic Soma ritual, we can see the same stacked design as at Chavín and Eleusis, adapted to a different geography and a different symbolic tradition. The preparation period is the extended set and setting phase. In the Agni Kayana, this is literally months of ritual practice and rehearsal before the 12-day performance begins. The construction of the altar is the therapeutic ritual, a sustained 12-day, mathematically precise act of building that focuses the participants' attention and generates the container within which the pharmacological event will occur. The chanting is the sonic intervention. The Soma itself is the pharmacology. The trained priesthood, 17 strong, functions as the interpretive relationship, the trusted others whose presence and expertise structure the sacrificer's experience of the ritual. Each component recruits an independent neural mechanism. The combined effect is the Vedic experience of Soma. The hymns of the Rigveda are the surviving phenomenological reports of what that combined effect produced in the priests who wrote them. The Immortality Claim. I want to close this chapter with the claim that has caused the most difficulty for modern interpreters, because the framework of this book allows us to look at it clearly rather than deflecting into metaphor. The Rigveda states repeatedly and unambiguously that Soma made its drinkers immortal. The word Amrita is used. The word means deathless, literally undying. It is used elsewhere in Sanskrit literature in contexts where the ordinary meaning is beyond question. The naive modern move is to interpret this claim symbolically. The Vedic priests did not really believe they had become immortal in a literal physical sense, the argument runs. They were expressing a felt experience of transcendence in mythologically appropriate language. This interpretation is probably wrong. The Vedic priests were sophisticated observers of the world, and they were describing their experience in a language whose precision they controlled carefully. When they said Amrita, they meant something specific. What they meant, I would suggest, is exactly what modern high-dose psychedelic research consistently documents in ritual settings. The participant enters a state in which the boundaries of the self dissolve, in which death appears as one moment in a much larger and continuous flow of being, in which the fear of personal extinction loses its usual force. This state has been called ego dissolution in the contemporary clinical literature, and it is one of the most reliably documented effects of high-dose psilocybin, LSD, and mescaline administration in supportive settings. Participants in modern psychedelic trials frequently describe the experience in language that sounds essentially identical to what the Rigveda describes. They have gone beyond mortality. They have found what was hidden. They no longer fear what they previously feared. The Vedic priests were not being metaphorical. They were describing what they experienced. Whether the experience corresponds to a metaphysical fact about the underlying nature of consciousness is a separate question, and the framework of this book, following Part 1, Section 1.5, does not require an answer to that question. What we can say is that the phenomenological report of the Rigveda matches the phenomenological reports of modern psychedelic research participants, with a specificity that suggests the same underlying neural state was being accessed. The Vedic priests had built a ritual technology capable of reliably producing that state. When they said they had become immortal, they meant it. Registers at the established register, the Rigveda's textual descriptions of the plant, the preparation, and the effects, the geometry and construction procedures of the Agni Kayana altar as preserved in the Shulba Sutras, the surviving Nambudiri tradition as documented by Stahl in 1975 and in subsequent performances, the ephedra pollen residues at Gonur Tepe as evidence of ritualized pressing practice in the correct geographical and temporal range, the mathematical sophistication of the altar geometry. At the contested register, the botanical identity of the original Rigvedic Soma, the specific role of pennyroyal analog admixtures, if any, whether the original plant was replaced due to loss of supply, migration, or theological change. The extent to which surviving Nambudiri performance preserves original practice versus later modifications. At the story register, the first-person hymnic testimonies of the Soma drinker, particularly Rigveda 848.3 and 10.119, the Immortality Claim as a phenomenological report, the felt experience of the modern Nambudiri priests during the surviving ritual, the specific descriptions of light, expansion, and dissolution of scale that recur throughout Mandala 9. The Vedic Soma tradition demonstrates something important about the argument of this book that neither Chavín nor Eleusis makes as visible. It demonstrates that when the pharmacology is stripped out of a ritual technology, the remaining architectural, sonic, mathematical, and social components still produce meaningful effects on the participants. The choir with one voice missing still sings. This has direct implications for the argument of Document 2, that ritual technology can amplify the effects of non-psychedelic compounds through the same mechanisms, because it shows the mechanism operating in reverse. If a ritual designed around a psychedelic can still function without the psychedelic, then a ritual designed around a non-psychedelic can add pharmacological amplification through the ritual container itself. The mechanism is bidirectional. The Nambudiri Agni Kayana proves it. We turn next to Mexico and to a ritual tradition that was suppressed like Eleusis, but survived underground and re-emerged in the mid-20th century, allowing us to observe an ancient practice in continuous form. The Mazatec Velada. 2.4. The Mazatec Velada, María Sabina and the Living Tradition. On the night of June 29 and 30, 1955, in a small house in the town of Huautla de Jiménez in the Sierra Mazateca of Oaxaca, southern Mexico, a curandera named María Sabina Magdalena Garcia conducted a velada for 2 American visitors. One of them, R. Gordon Wasson, was a New York banker who had spent nearly 2 decades pursuing an ethnographic obsession with sacred mushrooms across multiple cultures. The other was Alan Richardson, a photographer Wasson had brought with him. Wasson had gained Sabina's trust over previous visits by professing concern for the well-being of his son, framing the visit as a request for divinatory healing rather than as ethnography. Sabina conducted the ceremony as she had conducted many others, at night, in her house, by candlelight, chanting throughout in the Mazatec language, sharing psilocybin mushrooms with her guests as the community had shared them for generations. What she did not know, or was not fully told, was that Wasson was recording the ceremony, that he would publish it, and that within 2 years the entire ecosystem of her practice would be irreversibly altered by the arrival of thousands of foreign seekers. I want to acknowledge the history of that encounter honestly at the outset, before turning to the ritual itself. Wasson's 1957 article in Life magazine, titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom, a title Wasson himself did not choose, but which stuck, introduced the Mazatec mushroom ceremony to a mass American audience. Timothy Leary read the article and traveled to Mexico that same year, and the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s was seeded from that reading. Sabina, meanwhile, watched her home be raided by federal police, her house be burned by community members who blamed her for the influx of hippies and tourists, her son be killed in circumstances the family attributed to the disruption, and her own reputation in Huautla shift from respected sabia to controversial figure. She died in poverty in 1985. The material we are about to discuss was extracted from a specific community in a specific historical moment, with consequences the community did not choose. The ritual technology this chapter reconstructs is not our inheritance to freely take. It is Mazatec cultural knowledge preserved by a specific lineage of Mazatec practitioners, and any use of it by anyone outside that tradition ought to be accompanied by an ongoing awareness of what its Western circulation has cost the people who kept it alive. With that acknowledged, I turn to what the tradition actually consists of, because it is one of the most extensively documented living examples of the kind of ritual technology this book is trying to describe. The sabia and her lineage. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 1, 37. María Sabina was born in 1994 in Huautla de Jiménez, in a Mazatec-speaking family whose paternal lineage included several practitioners of the traditional healing arts. Her grandfather and great-grandfather on her father's side had been healers. This is not incidental. The Mazatec tradition holds that the calling to become a Chiota Chiane, the one who knows, the person of knowledge, the traditional term for a healer, translated into Spanish as curandero or curandera, is passed through family lines, and often confirmed by specific experiences in childhood. Sabina first consumed the mushrooms when she was around 7 or 8 years old, in circumstances she later described in detail in the biographical interviews Álvaro Estrada published in Spanish in 1976 as Vida de María Sabina, La Sabia de los Hongos, and in English as María Sabina, Her Life in Chants, in 1981. She practiced the ceremony in an ongoing relationship with what she called the Niños Santos, the Holy Children, the mushrooms themselves, addressed and treated as sentient teachers rather than as consumed objects. The Mazatec ceremony, as Sabina practiced it, is not a spontaneous or improvised event. It is a highly structured intervention that draws on pre-Columbian Mesoamerican ritual practice, incorporates syncretic Catholic elements introduced during the colonial period, and follows a specific sequence that Mazatec healers have transmitted through unbroken oral tradition, despite 4 centuries of Spanish colonial and post-colonial suppression. The tradition survived. Mazatec Mushroom Velada, New York, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. During what Mazatec accounts sometimes call the Long Silence, from the 16th century onward, mushroom ceremonies were conducted in secret, in remote mountain communities, in family homes at night, with participation limited to those who could be trusted not to report the practice to church or civil authorities. The Sierra Mazateca is geographically remote and culturally distinct, and the geographic isolation was the primary factor that allowed the tradition to persist while similar practices in more accessible regions were extinguished. When Wasson arrived in 1955, he was participating in a ritual that had been continuously practiced for centuries, transmitted through a specific set of surviving lineages, of which the Sabina family was one. The mushrooms and what they are called. The active pharmacological component of the Velada is psilocybin, the tryptamine alkaloid found in a range of mushroom species native to the Mazatec highlands. The primary species used by Sabina and by the current Mazatec tradition is Psilocybe caerulescens, sometimes called the landslide mushroom for its habit of growing on disturbed earth, with additional use of Psilocybe mexicana and several other locally growing psilocybin-containing species. The mushrooms are consumed fresh whenever possible, and traditionally in pairs, 1 male and 1 female, following a Mazatec principle that pairs the mushrooms in a way that reflects the tradition's understanding of complementary opposites. The Mazatec names for the mushrooms are worth attending to, because they carry the tradition's own theory of what the mushrooms are. Ni Shinto means roughly little ones that spring forth. Niños Santos means holy children. The mushrooms are not treated as drugs. They are treated as persons, small, revered, capable of speech, deserving of respect. Sabina consistently insisted throughout her life that she did not compose her chants. The mushrooms composed them. She was the vessel through which the Niños Santos spoke. This is a specific theological claim about the nature of the ritual, and it deserves to be preserved rather than translated away into modern psychological categories. What Sabina reported experiencing was not that the mushrooms produced altered states in her, which she then interpreted as speech, but that the mushrooms themselves spoke through her, and her role was to be a clear enough channel that their language could be heard. The structure of the Velada. The Velada is a nocturnal vigil, the word derived from the Spanish velar, to keep watch, and the ceremony takes place after dark, most often in the home of the curandera, and lasts from a few hours to a full night, depending on the specifics of the healing being attempted. The ceremony is not usually a private encounter between the healer and one patient. Family members and close acquaintances of the patient are typically present. Sabina's own ceremonies often involved half a dozen or more participants, including relatives of the person being healed, though the pharmacological intensity was highly variable across participants. The healer typically consumed substantially more mushrooms than the other attendees. In the Wasson recordings, Sabina reportedly ate twice as many mushrooms as her guests. The ceremony is preceded by careful preparation. Participants are expected to observe several days of abstinence, from sexual activity, from red meat, from spicy foods, from alcohol, as a form of purification that both prepares the body for the mushroom's effect and marks the participant's entry into the ritual container. Fasting or restricted eating in the hours before the ceremony is standard. On the day of the Velada, the curandera typically performs a preliminary divinatory reading using corn kernels, eggs, or candles, both to clarify the nature of the healing being requested and to assess whether the ceremony should proceed. This preliminary divination is not a formality. It is a diagnostic step in which the curandera reads the situation to determine what needs to happen. After the ceremony, a closing divination is performed to interpret what the mushrooms have revealed. The ceremony itself takes place in near total darkness, or in the dim light of a single candle. The candle is significant. It provides the only visual reference point in an otherwise dark room, and it functions as a focal object for the participants' visual attention during the peak of the mushroom's effect. The mushrooms are consumed early in the ceremony, usually within the first hour. The onset takes 30 to 45 minutes. During the onset period, the curandera prepares the participants, sometimes with prayers that combine Mazatec invocations with Catholic saints and the Virgin of Guadalupe, sometimes with the sharing of tobacco or the burning of copal incense. And then, as the mushrooms take effect, the curandera begins to chant. The chants, this is what the Velada is, at its core, a night of chanting by the curandera under the influence of a substantial dose of psilocybin, with the participants also under the influence at lower doses, in the darkness of a small room. The chants are the ritual. They are what Sabina's tradition transmitted forward across generations. They are what Wasson recorded in 1955, and again in 1956, and again in 1958. They are what was transcribed by the Wasson team with the linguistic assistance of Eunice Pike and George Cowan and their colleagues at the Summer Institute of Linguistics. The transcription is preserved in the 1974 monograph, Maria Sabina and her Mazatec Mushroom Velada, published by Harcourt Brace Jovanovic, with musical notation by Willard Rhodes, and included on the accompanying audio recordings, later reissued by Smithsonian Folkways. The chants are extraordinary. They are also, formally, a distinct genre of Mazatec oral poetry. Mexican poet Homero Eriges called Sabina the greatest visionary poet in 20th century Latin America. That assessment is not eccentric. The chants operate at multiple linguistic levels simultaneously. They contain direct invocations of the mushrooms and the deities. They contain first-person declarations of the curandera's identity that shift into first-person declarations of the mushroom's identity, so that it becomes ambiguous, sometimes deliberately so, who is speaking. They contain repeated phrases that build sonic and rhythmic momentum. They contain metaphors of natural forces, of light, of movement, of birds and stars and thunder. The most famous of Sabina's chants, sometimes called the Identity Chant, includes lines that in Estrada's translation read, "I am a woman who thunders. I am a woman who speaks. I am a woman who sounds. I am a woman of light. I am a woman of the day. I am a book woman. I am a spirit woman. I am a saint woman. I am a shooting star woman. I am a moon woman. I am a cross woman. I am a woman who has just been born. I am a woman of the whirling wind. I am a woman who sees." This is not decorative language. This is functional ritual technology. What the Identity Chant is doing, mechanistically, is establishing an interpretive framework within which the peaking mushroom experience will resolve. The participants, at the moment the chant is being delivered, are entering the deepest phase of the psilocybin experience. The default mode network in their brains is being suppressed. The boundaries between self and world are becoming permeable. And into that state of maximum permeability, the curandera is inserting a specific series of self-identifications that name the ritual, name the moment, name the presence of the divine, and name the identity of the one speaking as continuous with cosmic forces. The participant's sense of what is happening is being actively shaped by the words the curandera is chanting. This is the meaning response mechanism from Kapchuk's placebo research operating at ritual scale, in real time, in a specific traditional language, on a group of participants whose neurochemistry has been optimized to receive it. The chants shift throughout the night. They move from opening invocations through diagnostic language in which the curandera addresses the specific ailment being treated, through periods of intense visionary description, through moments of quiet, through closing prayers that seal the ceremony and return the participants to ordinary consciousness. Vomiting by the person being healed is considered a normal and even expected part of the process, a physical purging that the tradition understands as the ejection of the sickness. The full ceremony lasts several hours. Participants sometimes speak or move. More often they remain still, listening, in the darkness, while the curandera's voice rises and falls, and the mushrooms do their work. Mushroom Ceremony of the Mazatec Indians of Mexico, Smithsonian Folkways, FR 8975. What the choir consists of. Applying the framework of Part 1 to the Mazatec Velada makes the design principles visible in a form that is unusually clear, because we have direct recordings and living practitioners to work from. The pharmacological component is well characterized. Psilocybin is metabolized in the body to psilocin, which acts as a partial agonist at serotonin 5-HT2A receptors, and produces the family of effects now extensively documented in contemporary clinical research: altered perception, ego dissolution, emotional intensification, and the reduction of activity in the brain's default mode network. The Mazatec tradition arrived at these effects empirically. Sabina did not know the receptor pharmacology of psilocybin. She knew that certain mushrooms, prepared in certain ways, produced certain reliable states in the participants who consumed them, and that within those states, specific interventions could be effective. The set and setting components are stacked with the same deliberateness we saw at Chavín and Eleusis. The days of dietary abstinence and sexual restraint before the ceremony establish the metabolic and psychological substrate. The location, the curandera's own home, familiar to the community with its altar and its saints and its images, provides a container that is safe, private, and pre-consecrated. The darkness reduces visual input and shifts attention inward. The candle provides a focal point. The presence of trusted family members provides the social support that Kapchuk's placebo research has documented as a distinct causal component. The preparatory divination establishes the interpretive frame before the ceremony begins. The curandera's authority, built over years of practice and family lineage, functions as the trained interpretive relationship that structures the participant's experience of what is happening. And then, the chanting. This is where the Mazatec design has a component that the historical case studies of the earlier chapters can only approximate. At Chavín and Eleusis, we have to reconstruct what the priests were doing during the peak of the ritual, because the traditions were suppressed and the specific chants are lost. In the Mazatec case, the chants survive. We can hear them. We can transcribe them. We can analyze the Engineered Ecstasy, listening script, Part 1, 41, the specific pitches, rhythms, and word choices that Sabina was using at each phase of the ceremony. Contemporary research on chanting practices has documented measurable effects on autonomic nervous system function, on heart rate variability, on cortisol levels, and on brainwave synchronization. What is being demonstrated in the Mazatec Velada is that a trained voice, chanting continuously in the darkness while participants are under the influence of a potent serotonergic psychedelic, can guide the participants' experience in specific directions through the direct action of sound on the nervous system. The chant is not commentary on the experience. The chant is a component of the experience. The choir at its full volume, in the Mazatec case, includes the pharmacology of the psilocybin, the physiological state produced by the dietary preparation, the sensory environment of the darkened room, the visual anchor of the candle, the social support of the trusted attendants, the interpretive authority of the curandera, the specific action of the chanted sound, and the meaning frame provided by the invocations, the saints, and the identity claims that name the moment and the presence of the divine. Every component is present. Every component is contributing. The result is a ritual technology that has demonstrably healed people in Mazatec accounts for centuries, and that, in the encounter with modern psychiatric conditions like treatment-resistant depression, has produced effects that current psilocybin clinical trials are beginning to systematically document, without yet having replicated the full ritual container. Phenomenological reports. The story register material for the Mazatec tradition is unusually rich. In addition to the recorded chants themselves, we have Sabina's own accounts of her mushroom experiences in the Estrada biography, and we have Wasson's own detailed account of his 1955 experience, published in the 1957 Life article and in more sober form in his subsequent scholarly works. Wasson's account included the following specific claims, which I want to preserve in his own framing. He experienced visions of extraordinary clarity and beauty, geometric patterns, palaces, landscapes, entities. He experienced a sense that ordinary time had been suspended, and that he was inhabiting a mode of consciousness qualitatively distinct from waking life. He experienced what he described as a sense of the sacredness of everything he perceived. He came away from the ceremony convinced that he had encountered something real and important, and that the Western dismissal of indigenous mushroom traditions as primitive superstition was a substantial intellectual and spiritual error. Wasson was not a man given to easy mystical enthusiasm. His subsequent work took the phenomenological claims of the traditions he studied seriously, in the same way that this book is trying to. Sabina herself, throughout the Estrada biography, describes the mushroom experience in language that recurs across her many veladas. She speaks of ascending, of light, of the principal ones, 12 entities that appear during the ceremony, and that she variously identified with mushrooms themselves, with ancestral spirits, and with the syncretized figures of Christian iconography. She speaks of the mushrooms teaching, healing, and revealing. She speaks of being taken through experiences that she could not fully articulate in ordinary language, and of the chants being what she called the words the mushrooms gave her to speak the experience out. There is no separation, in Sabina's account, between the medical, the ceremonial, the poetic, and the metaphysical dimensions of what she is doing. It is all one intervention aimed at a specific outcome: the suppression and the survival. I want to close this chapter where I opened it, with the specific damage that the Wasson publication did to the community that had preserved the tradition. Wasson himself, in his later years, expressed deep regret about what had followed his 1957 article. He wrote in one of his subsequent books that he had unleashed on lovely Huautla a torrent of commercial exploitation of the vilest kind. Now the mushrooms are exposed for sale everywhere, in every marketplace, in every village doorway. The tourism that followed the article's publication was not primarily seeking healing. It was seeking novelty, transgression, spiritual tourism, and access to a substance that was not yet legally regulated in the way it would soon become. The commodification degraded the community's own relationship to the ritual. The federal attention that followed disrupted Sabina's practice, damaged her family, and left her at the end of her life in a precarious position within a community that had once revered her. And yet the tradition survived. It continues to survive today. There are living Chota Chine in Huautla and elsewhere in the Sierra Mazateca who continue to conduct veladas for their communities. Some of them have made accommodations to receive foreign visitors, others have refused. The knowledge is being transmitted forward, family by family, exactly as it was during the long silence. What Wasson recorded in 1955 was not a museum piece being preserved in amber. It was a living tradition being practiced by a specific curandera on a specific night, and both the tradition and its lineage of practitioners are still with us. The ritual technology is not lost. It never was lost. It was suppressed, and it survived, and it continues. The Mazatec case is important for the argument of this book because it shows in living form what the choir principle looks like when the entire ritual technology is intact and being continuously practiced. Chavín and Eleusis require reconstruction. The Mazatec Velada requires only respectful attention. And what respectful attention shows us is that all the elements of the argument I laid out in Part 1 are present, working together in the way the choir principle predicts they should. The result is a ceremony that has continued to produce transformation in its participants for as long as the tradition has been continuous, which is at least the 4 centuries of the colonial and post-colonial period, and probably substantially longer. Registers. At the established register, the ritual sequence as documented in the Wasson recordings and Estrada biography, the pharmacology of psilocybin, the identity of the mushroom species used, the continuity of the tradition as documented by ethnographic study, the Engineered Ecstasy, listening script Part 1, 43, specific chants themselves as recorded and transcribed, the historical impact of the 1955 encounter and 1957 publication on both the Mazatec community and the broader Western engagement with psychedelics. At the contested register, the specific pre-Columbian antiquity of the current form of the Velada, which is likely substantial but not directly documented, the exact syncretic history of the Catholic elements, the specific mechanisms by which the chants act on participant consciousness, well documented at the level of chanting research generally, less directly studied for the specific Mazatec chants, the effectiveness of the tradition for specific clinical conditions in modern populations. At the story register, Sabina's account of the principal ones and the mushroom's direct communication, the phenomenological content of the identity chant, and its many variants, Wasson's account of his 1955 experience, the accounts of contemporary participants in traditional and reconstructed veladas, the specific reports of healing that Mazatec accounts document across centuries. The Mazatec Velada is one of the most fully preserved living examples of the ritual technology this book is trying to describe. It should be studied with the respect that its transmission through 4 centuries of hostile conditions has earned. It should not be replicated by outsiders without a serious engagement with the ethical and cultural questions its Western circulation has raised. And it should be understood, in the framework of this book, as one of the clearest examples of the choir principle operating in a fully intact form. Pharmacology, ritual, sound, community, interpretive framework, all working together to produce reliable transformation in participants who are prepared to receive it. We turn next to another living tradition that has similarly survived colonial disruption on another continent, using an entirely different plant, the Bwiti Iboga initiation of Gabon. The Engineered Ecstasy, listening script Part 1, 44 series outro. You have reached the end of Part 1 of the Engineered Ecstasy, presented as part of the Historical Documents Access Project. Part 2 continues with Bwiti Iboga initiation and the Aztec sacred mushroom tradition documented in the Florentine Codex. It then turns to a contemporary case study, the mechanisms that may underlie ritual effects, and the author's final synthesis. Thank you for listening and for supporting wider English language access to important historical documents and research. Continue with Part 2 to complete this title.